The great hall of Voss Castle had never been so silent. Hundreds of wolves stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the tall stone arches, their breath held, their eyes fixed on the man standing at the top of the marble steps. Torches burned along the walls, throwing long shadows across the crowd, but nobody moved. Nobody dared. Elena stood near the front, dressed in a simple blue gown, her hands folded in front of her. She had chosen that spot on purpose. For 3 years, she had stood beside Damien Voss in every important moment of his life, and tonight, the night he became Alpha King, she wanted to be close enough to see his face when the crown touched his head. She had healed him more times than she could count. She had stitched wounds on his arms after border fights, pulled fevers from his body after poison attacks, and sat beside his father's bed through the old king's final weeks, holding both men together when neither had the strength to hold himself. She had done all of this quietly, without asking for anything in return, because she loved him. She had never said the word out loud, but everyone close to them knew. The crown was lowered onto Damien's head, and the hall erupted into cheers. Elena clapped along with everyone else, her chest warm with pride. This was his moment. She had waited for it as much as he had. Then Damien raised his hand, and the cheering stopped. "Before this night ends," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hall, "there is something I must make clear." Elena felt a small flicker of unease, but she pushed it away. He often made announcements after ceremonies, new laws, new alliances, new plans for the kingdom. This was probably nothing more than that. Damien's eyes moved across the crowd until they landed on her. "A kingdom needs a queen who is worthy of its crown," he said. "A queen with strength, with lineage, with the blood to lead alongside a king." The unease in Elena's chest turned into something colder. "I have arranged a union with Serafina of the Thornfield Pack," Damien continued. "Her family commands 3,000 warriors and controls the eastern trade routes. This alliance will secure our borders for a generation." A murmur ran through the crowd. Elena did not move. She told herself this was politics, nothing more. Alphas married for alliances all the time. It did not mean what she feared it meant. Then Damien's gaze settled on her again, and this time there was no warmth in it at all. "Elena," he said, and the sound of her name in that cold voice made her stomach twist. "You have served this pack well. But a healer's daughter, born outside the royal bloodlines, cannot stand beside a throne. You are not worthy of my throne. Effective tonight, your place in this castle has ended." The words hit her like a physical blow. For a moment she could not breathe. She heard gasps around her, felt eyes turning toward her, but she could not look away from Damien's face. She searched it for some sign that he did not mean it, some flicker of the man who had once held her hand through a long night and told her he did not know how he would survive without her. She found nothing. His expression was carved from stone. "You may collect your belongings tonight," he said, already turning away from her, already looking toward the doors where a young woman in a deep red gown was entering the hall, flanked by guards wearing unfamiliar colors. "Serafina. You will be gone by morning." The hall began to move again, voices rising, guests shifting to make way for the new arrival, and somehow, in the middle of all that motion, Elena remained perfectly still, as though the ground beneath her had turned to ice. She did not cry. Not there, not in front of hundreds of people who had watched her be discarded like an old coat. She held her spine straight, the way her mother had taught her, and she turned and walked toward the doors at the back of the hall, each step steady, even though her legs felt as though they belonged to someone else. Nobody stopped her. That was the part that hurt most. Not one person reached out. Not one voice called her name. She had spent 3 years making sure this kingdom ran smoothly, and in the space of 30 seconds, she had become invisible to all of it. She walked through the long corridor that led to the healer's quarters, past the training yards where she had once stitched a young soldier's arm by torchlight, past the garden where she had grown herbs for every fever and wound that came through the castle gates. Everything here held a memory. Every stone had a story, and none of it belonged to her anymore. Her room was small and plain, tucked near the healing wing so she could reach patients quickly at night. She had never asked for anything grander. She began pulling her belongings from the shelves, folding her clothes with hands that trembled only slightly. A few dried herbs, a stack of healing notes written in her careful handwriting, a small wooden box that held her mother's old pendant, the only thing she had left of her family before she came to serve the Voss pack. As she packed, her mind kept circling back to that night 3 years ago, the first time she had truly understood what Damien carried on his shoulders. His father had been dying slowly, the illness eating away at him month by month, and Damien had come to her workroom late one night, exhausted and afraid, in a way he never let anyone else see. "I don't know how to be him," he had said, meaning his father, meaning the king. "I don't know how to carry all of this." She had sat with him until dawn that night, not saying much, just being present, just letting him know he was not alone. It became a pattern after that. Whenever the weight became too much, he came to her. She never told anyone what he shared with her in those quiet hours. She never used it against him, never asked for favors in return. She simply loved him, in the steady, patient way that asked for nothing. She thought of the border conflict 2 years ago, when a rival pack called the Pharaoh had pushed into Voss territory, burning 2 villages before anyone could respond. Damien had wanted to answer with full force, a war that would have cost hundreds of lives on both sides. Elena had gone to the Pharaoh elders herself, alone, unarmed, and spent 3 days negotiating a fragile truce that held to this day. She had never told Damien the full danger she had put herself in. She had simply come back with peace in her hands, and let him take the credit for the calm that followed. She thought of the soldiers she had saved after countless skirmishes, the fevers she had broken through long nights, the poison she had once drawn from Damien's own blood after an assassination attempt that nearly took his life. She had nearly died doing it, her own body absorbing enough of the poison to leave her sick for a week afterward. Nobody in that hall tonight knew about any of it, because she had never asked them to know. She had done it all quietly, the way healers were taught to do, believing that love did not need an audience. And in the end, none of it had mattered. Blood and title had mattered. She had not been born into the right family, and so nothing she had given, nothing she had bled, nothing she had sacrificed, could ever make her worthy in his eyes. She finished packing, just as the first gray light of morning touched the window. Her bag was small, holding almost nothing after 3 years of service. She looked around the room one last time, memorizing it, though she was not sure why. She did not think she would ever want to remember this place. As she stepped into the hallway, she passed a young guard named Finn, who had been on duty outside the healing wing for the past year. He was one of the few people who had always treated her with simple kindness, without caring about her bloodline or her place in the castle's hierarchy. "Elena," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was near. "I heard what happened. I'm sorry." "Thank you, Finn," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Take care of yourself." "Where will you go?" She had not thought that far ahead. Not really. But as she said it, she realized the answer had been forming in her heart since the moment Damien spoke those cruel words. "Home," she said. "Ashwood." Finn nodded slowly. "Your family's pack. That's a long walk from here." "I've walked longer for less important reasons," she said, and for the first time since the ceremony, something like a smile touched her lips, small and tired, but real. She left through the eastern gate, avoiding the main courtyard where servants were already beginning to clean up from the celebration, where the scent of last night's feast still hung in the air. She did not want to see the banners, the flowers, the signs of a night that was supposed to have been joyful. She did not want to see Serafina's red gown draped over some chair, evidence of the woman who had replaced her before the sun had even fully risen. The road away from Voss Castle was long and quiet. Elena walked without looking back, her small bag over her shoulder, the morning cold biting at her hands. She thought about crying, thought that surely somewhere on this road the tears would finally come, but they did not. Instead, something else settled into her chest, something that felt strangely like clarity. She had given 3 years of her life to a man who, in the end, valued her by the family she was born into, rather than everything she had actually done. She had healed him, protected him, carried his secrets and his fears, and none of it had been enough to earn her a place at his side once a more advantageous option appeared. She realized, somewhere around midday, that grief and anger could live in the same body at the same time. She grieved the years she had given, the love she had poured into a man who discarded her without a second thought. But beneath that grief, something harder was forming, a quiet resolve. She would not spend the rest of her life waiting for someone to decide she was worthy. She would decide that for herself. The road curved past a small trading post around midday, a cluster of wooden stalls where merchants from different packs gathered to sell cloth, tools, and dried food. Elena had passed through here many times over the years, usually on errands for the castle, always recognized and greeted warmly by the traders who knew her as the healer who never charged the poor for her remedies. Today, when an older merchant named Callum looked up and saw her walking alone with a single bag over her shoulder, his friendly smile faltered. "Elena," he said, setting down the roll of cloth in his hands, "where's your escort? You never travel this road without guards from the castle." "I don't need an escort anymore, Callum," she said, keeping her voice light, even though the words tasted bitter. "I no longer serve the castle." His eyebrows rose, and for a moment he looked as though he might ask more, but something in her expression must have told him not to. Instead, he reached beneath his stall and pulled out a small parcel wrapped in cloth. "Take this then, dried meat and bread. The road to Ashwood is long, and you'll want your strength." She tried to refuse, but he pressed it into her hands anyway. "You mended my daughter's leg 2 winters ago, and never asked for a single coin. Let an old man return a kindness." The small act of generosity nearly broke through the careful composure she had built since leaving the castle. She thanked him, tucking the parcel into her bag, and continued on before her eyes could betray her. As she walked, her thoughts drifted back further than the night before, back to the very beginning, to the day she had first arrived at Voss Castle as a girl of 19, sent by her father to study advanced healing methods under the royal physician. She remembered how nervous she had been, how out of place she felt among the polished stone halls and the confident, sharp-tongued nobles who filled them. She remembered the first time she had seen Damien, not yet a king, still a young man learning the weight of his father's throne, standing in the training yard with a sword in his hand, sweat on his brow, laughing at something one of his men had said. He had not been cruel then, or if he was, she had never seen that side of him. He had been serious about his duties, sometimes harsh with himself when he failed to meet his own expectations, but he had always been kind to the people who worked quietly in the background of his life. He used to bring her tea when she worked late into the night preparing remedies. He used to ask about her family, about Ashwood, about the small pack she had left behind. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that the affection between them was mutual and equal, built on years of shared hardship and quiet trust. She wondered now how much of that affection had been real, and how much had simply been convenience. A healer who asked for nothing, who was always available, who never made demands on his time or his heart. Perhaps she had been useful to him in the same way a well-worn coat is useful, comfortable and familiar, until something finer came along. The thought made her chest ache, but she refused to let it slow her steps. She had cried enough tears in her lifetime over things she could not control. She would not spend the rest of the journey grieving a man who had made his choice so easily, so publicly, so cruelly. Around mid-afternoon, she encountered a small group of travelers heading in the opposite direction, toward Voss territory. They were merchants as well, their cart loaded with barrels of wine meant for the coronation celebrations, though from the look of the sun, they would arrive well after the festivities had ended. One of them, a young woman with sharp eyes, glanced at Elena's simple traveling clothes and raised an eyebrow. "You look like you've come from the castle," the woman said. "Is it true the new king took a bride from Thornfield last night?" "It's true," Elena said simply. "They say the ceremony was grand. Half the packs in the region sent representatives." The woman studied Elena more closely. "You don't look like you enjoyed it much." Elena managed a small, tired smile. "It wasn't my celebration to enjoy." The travelers moved on, and Elena continued walking, grateful they had not recognized her, grateful the story of her dismissal had not yet spread far enough to reach strangers on the road. She knew it would, eventually. Gossip traveled fast among the packs, faster than any messenger on horseback. By the time she reached Ashwood, some version of the story would likely have arrived before her, twisted and reshaped by every mouth that carried it. She found she did not care as much as she thought she would. Let them talk. Let them wonder. She knew the truth of what she had given to that kingdom, even if no one else ever fully understood it. The forest grew denser as the afternoon wore on, the trees pressing closer together, the light growing dimmer beneath their branches. Elena had grown up near forests like this one, and the familiar scent of pine and damp earth brought a strange comfort despite everything that had happened. This was the smell of home, or at least the smell of the road that led there. She thought about her parents, both gone now, her father a healer like her mother a gentle woman who had taught her patience, even when the world gave her every reason to lose it. She thought about her younger brother, Corin, who still lived in Ashwood, who had written to her, only a handful of times over the past 3 years, always asking when she would visit, always understanding when her duties at the castle kept her away. She wondered what he would say when she arrived on his doorstep, dismissed and humiliated, with nothing to show for 3 years of service, except a small bag of belongings and a heart full of hard lessons. He would not judge her. Of that much she was certain. Corin had never cared about titles or bloodlines or the politics of larger packs. He cared about family, about loyalty, about the people who had raised him. If anything, she suspected he would be furious on her behalf, the kind of quiet, simmering anger that ran deep in men who loved fiercely but rarely raised their voices. The trees here were old and tall, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the fading light. She had walked this path once before, 3 years ago, in the opposite direction, full of hope and excitement about the new life waiting for her at Voss Castle. She had been young then, believing that hard work and loyalty would be enough to earn a place in any world she chose to enter. She knew better now. The forest grew louder as dusk approached, filled with the calls of night birds settling into their roosts and the distant rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth. Elena had never been afraid of these sounds. Her father had taught her to read a forest the way other people read books, to know which noises meant danger, and which meant only the ordinary business of wild things going about their evening. Tonight, the familiar sounds felt like company, a reminder that the world continued on around her, even though her own life had been upended in a single night. She found a small clearing to rest in as darkness fell, gathering dry branches for a fire, the way her mother had taught her when she was a child. Her hands moved through the motions with practiced ease, arranging kindling, striking flint against stone, coaxing the first small flame into life. There was a strange comfort in doing something simple and physical, after a day spent carrying so much inside her mind. As the flames caught and began to crackle, she allowed herself, finally, to sit with everything that had happened. She unwrapped the parcel Callum had given her and ate slowly, watching the fire eat through the dry wood, listening to the forest settle around her. She thought about the years ahead, wondering what shape her life would take now that the path she had followed for so long had ended so abruptly. She had skills, she had knowledge, she had spent years learning to heal wounds both simple and severe, to fight fevers that other healers gave up on, to save lives that seemed already lost. None of that had disappeared simply because a king decided her bloodline made her unworthy of his throne. Perhaps, she thought, there was a kind of freedom in that. She no longer had to measure her worth by his approval. She no longer had to wonder whether her sacrifices would ever be acknowledged, whether her quiet labor would ever be seen. She could return to Ashwood and use everything she had learned to help her own people, without needing permission from anyone, without needing to prove herself to a crown that had never truly wanted her. The fire burned lower as the night deepened, and above the canopy, stars began to appear between gaps in the branches. Elena wrapped her cloak more tightly around her shoulders and leaned back against the trunk of an old oak, letting the events of the day finally catch up with her fully. The tears came then, quiet and unhurried, not the desperate sobbing of a broken heart, but something gentler, a release of grief that had been building since the moment Damien's voice had turned cold in that crowded hall. She let herself cry for a while, and when the tears finally slowed, she felt lighter, as though some heavy weight had shifted, even if it had not disappeared entirely. She thought of her mother's old saying, the one she used to repeat whenever life dealt Elena a disappointment too large to understand. The road that looks like an ending is sometimes only a turning. She did not know yet whether that would prove true, but she chose, in that quiet clearing beneath the stars, to believe it might be. She thought of Damien's face in that hall, cold and distant, a stranger wearing the features of the man she had loved. She thought of the crowd's silence, the way not one voice had risen in her defense. She thought of 3 years, reduced to nothing in the space of a single sentence. And slowly, as the fire burned low and the stars came out above the canopy, she made a decision. She would not go back. Whatever came next, whatever life awaited her among her own people, she would build it on her own terms, valued for who she was, rather than who she happened to be born to. She did not know, as she finally closed her eyes that night, that back at Voss Castle, the consequences of Damien's decision were already beginning to unfold. She did not know that the truce she had built with her own 2 hands was about to be tested in ways no one could have predicted. She did not know that within 3 days, the man who had called her unworthy would be riding through this very forest, desperate to find her. She knew only the cold ground beneath her, the dying fire beside her, and the long road home still ahead. And for the first time in 3 years, she realized that road belonged entirely to her. Councilman Bray had served 3 generations of the Voss family, and in all his years within those castle walls, he had never seen a room grow so cold so quickly. One moment, the hall rang with cheers for the new king. The next, silence pressed down like a physical weight, broken only by the soft sound of a young woman's footsteps retreating toward the doors. He had watched Elena go, watched the crowd part around her as though she carried some contagious misfortune, and something in his chest had tightened with a discomfort he could not immediately name. He was an old wolf, gray at the muzzle even in human form, with decades of political maneuvering behind his sharp eyes. He had seen alphas make foolish decisions before. He had seen kingdoms rise and fall on the whims of pride. But something about the particular cruelty of Damien's words that night unsettled him in a way he had not expected. He did not say anything during the celebration that followed. It was not his place to question the new king in front of visiting dignitaries, especially not in front of the Thornfield delegation, whose presence had clearly been the entire point of the evening's cruel announcement. He smiled when smiling was expected, raised his cup when toasts were made, and watched Serafina move through the hall with the practiced grace of someone who had been trained since childhood to charm rooms full of strangers. She was beautiful. There was no denying that. Dark hair, sharp cheekbones, a smile that reached exactly as far as it needed to, and no further. She spoke easily with the nobles gathered around her, complimenting the castle's architecture, asking pointed questions about trade agreements and military strength. Bray listened from a distance and noted, with the careful attention of a man who had survived decades of court politics, that not once did she ask about the well-being of the Pax people. Not once did she inquire after the soldiers wounded in recent border conflicts, or the villages still rebuilding after the Pharaoh raids 2 years prior. Her interest, as far as Bray could tell, began and ended with power. Later that night, long after the celebration had wound down and most of the guests had retired to their chambers, Bray found himself walking the quiet corridor that led toward the healing wing. He was not entirely sure what drew him there, perhaps some instinct, some old habit of checking on the parts of the castle that ran smoothly without ever demanding attention. He passed Elena's now empty room, the door left slightly ajar, and something made him step inside. The room was nearly bare. She had taken everything of value to her, leaving behind only the practical items that belonged to the position, rather than the person. A set of shelves for herbs, a worn wooden table stained with years of tinctures and remedies, a small stack of ledgers she had used to track patients and supplies. Bray picked up the topmost ledger out of idle curiosity, expecting nothing more than routine records of illnesses treated and herbs administered. What he found instead made him sit down slowly, on the edge of her narrow bed, reading by the light of a single candle he found still burning on her table. The ledger was not simply a record of medicine. It was a record of a war fought quietly, in the shadows of a kingdom that never knew how close it had come to disaster. He read an entry dated 2 years prior, describing in careful, clinical detail the treatment of a poison extracted from the king's own blood after an assassination attempt during a diplomatic dinner. Elena had written of drawing the poison out through direct contact, absorbing a portion of it into her own body, to slow its spread until stronger remedies could be prepared. She had nearly died doing it. The entry noted a full week of illness afterward, fever and weakness that she treated in secret, telling no one outside the healing wing what had truly happened, allowing the official story to remain a simple case of food poisoning quickly resolved. Bray turned the pages with growing disbelief. There was an account of the Pharaoh negotiations, written with the same understated precision. She had gone alone, unarmed, into hostile territory, staying 3 days among wolves who had every reason to want her dead, negotiating terms that had prevented what would surely have been a devastating war. The public record credited the peace to Damien's diplomatic skill and the strength of his warriors. Elena's ledger told a different story entirely, one of quiet courage that had never been acknowledged, not even by the man whose kingdom she had saved. There were dozens of smaller entries as well. Soldiers she had treated through the night when lesser healers had given up hope. A fever that swept through the eastern barracks 2 winters ago, which she had contained through weeks of exhausting work, preventing what could have become a catastrophic loss of fighting men. A young mother in the lower village whose difficult birth Elena had attended personally, saving both mother and child when the local healer admitted she lacked the skill to manage the complications. None of it had a name attached beyond her own careful signature at the bottom of each entry. None of it had ever been announced, celebrated, or rewarded. She had simply done the work, night after night, year after year, asking for nothing beyond the ability to continue serving the people she had grown to love. Bray closed the ledger slowly, his old hands trembling slightly, though whether from age or emotion he could not have said. He thought of the young king he had watched grow from a boy into a man, a king he had sworn loyalty to, and would continue to serve regardless of his own private doubts. He thought of the woman who had just walked out of that castle with nothing but a small bag over her shoulder, carrying with her 3 years of sacrifice that the very kingdom she had saved would never fully understand. He did not know, in that quiet moment, what he intended to do with the knowledge in his hands. Confronting the new king on his coronation night seemed both foolish and futile. Damien's decision had already been made, the humiliation already delivered in front of hundreds of witnesses. Undoing that publicly would cost the young king more pride than he was likely willing to sacrifice, even if presented with the truth. But Bray tucked the ledger beneath his arm and carried it back to his own chambers, deciding that the truth, once known, had a way of finding its moment eventually. He would keep it safe. He would wait. And if the day came when Damien was ready to hear it, he would be ready to speak. Elsewhere in the castle, in the chambers that had once belonged to the late king and now belonged to Damien, the new Alpha King sat alone by the dying light of his fireplace, still dressed in the ceremonial clothes from that night's celebration. He had dismissed his attendants hours ago, wanting solitude after a day that had drained him in ways he had not fully anticipated. The crown sat on a table beside him, gleaming faintly in the firelight, heavier in its symbolism than it had ever felt on his head. He told himself, again and again, that he had made the right decision. Political marriages secured kingdoms. Elena, for all her kindness, for all the years she had given him, could never have offered the strategic advantages that Serafina's family brought. His father had taught him that a king's decisions could not always follow his heart. Sometimes duty demanded sacrifice, and Damien had convinced himself, in the weeks leading up to the coronation, that this was simply another sacrifice he owed his people. But sitting alone now, staring into the fire, he found himself remembering things he had not allowed himself to think about while planning the announcement. He remembered the night his father died, how Elena had sat with him for hours afterward, saying nothing, simply present, absorbing his grief without demanding anything from him in return. He remembered a fever that had once gripped him after a border skirmish, how she had stayed by his bedside for 2 full days without sleep, refusing to leave even when his own advisors urged her to rest. He pushed the memories away, telling himself they belonged to the past, that the future required different priorities. Serafina was intelligent, capable, and her family's resources would strengthen the kingdom against threats that Damien knew were building on the horizon, particularly from the northern packs who had grown increasingly aggressive in recent months. This was strategy. This was leadership. This was what a king did. He almost believed himself entirely. Almost. Somewhere deep beneath the careful justifications he had built for himself, a small, quiet doubt remained, refusing to be silenced no matter how firmly he tried to reason it away. He told himself it was simply the exhaustion of a long day, the weight of a new crown settling uncomfortably on shoulders unaccustomed to its full burden. He told himself that by morning, with a clear head and a fresh perspective, the doubt would fade entirely. He did not yet understand how wrong he was. Down in the eastern barracks, a soldier named Garrick lay awake in his narrow bed, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion of the day's celebrations. He had heard, along with everyone else in the castle, about the healer's dismissal, and something about the news had settled uneasily in his chest. 2 winters ago, during the worst of the fever that swept through the barracks, Elena had spent countless nights at his bedside when the illness threatened to take him along with 3 of his closest friends. She had not slept for days, moving from cot to cot, refusing to rest until the worst of the outbreak had passed. He remembered her hands, steady and sure even after hours without rest, remembered the quiet confidence in her voice when she told him he would recover, remembered believing her simply because there had been nothing but honesty in her eyes. He wondered, lying there in the darkness, what would happen the next time fever swept through the barracks, the next time a soldier came home wounded from the border, the next time the kingdom needed the kind of quiet, tireless dedication that Elena had given so freely for so long. He did not know the answer, and the uncertainty kept him awake long after the rest of the castle had finally gone quiet. In the finest guest chamber of the castle, Serafina sat before a tall mirror, removing the jewels from her hair one by one with the help of a quiet attendant. She had watched the entire scene in the hall with careful interest, studying the healer who had been so publicly cast aside, studying the crowd's reaction, studying most of all the brief flash of something uncertain that had crossed Damien's face before he composed himself again. She was not a woman who missed such details. Her entire life had been a careful study of power, of how it was won and how it was lost, and she had learned early that the smallest cracks in a person's composure often revealed the most important truths. She did not care, particularly, about the healer herself. Elena was simply an obstacle that had been removed, a loose thread that Damien had cut away to secure the alliance her family offered. What interested Serafina was the flicker of doubt she had glimpsed in the new king's eyes, the way his gaze had lingered a moment too long on the doors Elena disappeared through. She filed the observation away carefully, the way she filed away every piece of useful information, understanding that a king with divided loyalties was a king who could be managed, guided, and eventually controlled. "He will forget her within a week," she said aloud to her attendant, though the words seemed meant more for herself than anyone else in the room. "Kings always do. There is too much to occupy his attention now. Borders to secure, armies to command, a wife to please." The attendant said nothing, simply continued her work in respectful silence, and Serafina allowed herself a small, satisfied smile as she studied her own reflection in the candlelight. She had traveled far to secure this position, had spent years being groomed by her family for exactly this kind of alliance, and she did not intend to let a forgotten healer's memory interfere with the future she had worked so hard to claim. What she did not yet understand, what none of them fully understood that night, was the depth of what Elena had actually built within these castle walls. Alliances secured through marriage contracts were fragile things, built on paper and promises that could shift with changing circumstances. What Elena had built was different entirely, woven through years of quiet trust between herself and the soldiers she healed, the villagers she helped, the rival packs she had personally convinced to lay down their weapons. It was not the kind of foundation that could simply be replaced by a new face at the king's side, no matter how strategically advantageous that face might appear on paper. Back in the barracks, Garrick finally drifted into a restless sleep sometime near dawn, his dreams tangled with memories of fever, and the steady sound of Elena's voice telling him he would live. He did not know that within a day, his body would begin fighting a return of the same illness that had nearly claimed him 2 winters before, a lingering weakness in his blood that Elena had always monitored carefully during her regular visits to the barracks, visits that had quietly continued long after his initial recovery, visits that would now simply stop, unnoticed by anyone who did not understand how much careful attention his condition still required. The castle settled into an uneasy quiet as the night wore on, torches burning low, guests retiring to their chambers, servants finally allowed their own rest after a long day of preparation and celebration. On the surface, everything appeared exactly as it should. The coronation had proceeded successfully. The alliance with Thornfield had been secured. The new king sat comfortably upon his throne, his kingdom stretched peacefully beneath him. But beneath that calm surface, small cracks had already begun to form, cracks that would widen with each passing hour, cracks that not one person within those castle walls yet understood the true danger of. The kingdom Elena had quietly held together through 3 years of tireless, unacknowledged devotion was about to discover, in the harshest way possible, exactly how much her absence would cost. Morning arrived at Voss Castle with a sharp, urgent knock on the king's chamber door. Damien woke from restless sleep to find his personal guard, a steady young man named Owen, standing in the doorway, with an expression that immediately set Damien's instincts on alert. "Forgive the intrusion, my king," Owen said, "but there is trouble at the eastern barracks. Several soldiers have fallen ill overnight. The garrison commander is asking for the healer. Damien sat up, rubbing a hand across his face, still shaking off the fog of a poor night's sleep. Send for one of the junior healers. There are 3 still stationed within the castle. We have, my king. But the illness resembles the fever outbreak from 2 winters past, and none of the junior healers have experience treating it. They are asking specifically for Elena. They say she is the only one who successfully managed the outbreak last time, and that she continued monitoring several of the affected soldiers privately in the months since. The name landed in Damien's chest like a stone dropped into still water. He had not expected to hear it again so soon, certainly not attached to an emergency of this scale. She is no longer employed by this castle, he said, his voice coming out sharper than he intended. Send the junior healers. They will manage. Owen hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, but years of discipline held his tongue. He bowed and left to relay the order, and Damien dressed quickly, telling himself the situation would resolve itself without further complication. It did not resolve itself. By midday, word reached the throne room that the junior healers, despite their best efforts, could not identify the correct combination of herbs to slow the fever's progress. 2 more soldiers had fallen ill, including Garrick, whose fever had spiked dangerously high within hours of waking. The garrison commander himself arrived at the castle, requesting an audience with the king, his expression grim with worry that he made no effort to hide. My king, the commander said, kneeling briefly, before rising to meet Damien's eyes directly, a gesture of respect that did not diminish the urgency in his voice. I do not wish to overstep, but I must speak plainly. 2 winters ago, this same fever nearly wiped out 1/3 of the eastern garrison before Elena arrived and contained it. She did not simply treat the sick. She identified the source of the outbreak, a contaminated well that the rest of us had overlooked entirely. Without her knowledge, I fear we may face the same losses again. Damien felt the weight of the room pressing against him, felt the eyes of his council watching to see how their new king would respond to the first real crisis of his reign. He thought of sending riders after Elena, thought of the pride that would need to be swallowed to do so, and found himself unable to give the order. Continue treating with the resources we have, he said instead. I trust our healers to manage this. The commander's jaw tightened, but he bowed and left without further argument, understanding that pressing the point further would accomplish nothing against a king determined not to reverse his own decision so soon after making it. That afternoon, Damien retreated to his private study, hoping for a quiet moment to gather his thoughts before the evening's diplomatic obligations began. Instead, he found Bray waiting for him, an old ledger resting on the table between them, his weathered face set in an expression Damien had rarely seen from the man who had advised his father for decades. What is this? Damien asked, though something in his gut already suspected the answer. Records, Bray said simply. Elena's records. I found them in her room the night she left. Damien opened the ledger slowly, his eyes moving across page after page of careful, detailed entries. He read of the poison drawn from his own blood, remembered vaguely the illness that had followed the diplomatic dinner 2 years prior, an illness he had been told was simple food poisoning, nothing more. He read of the pharaoh negotiations, remembered the relief that had swept through the kingdom when war had been avoided, a relief he had always attributed to his own diplomatic efforts and the strength of his warriors standing ready at the border. He read entry after entry, each one peeling back a layer of assumption he had carried without question for years, revealing a truth that settled into his chest with growing weight. Elena had not simply been a healer tending to minor wounds and common illnesses. She had been quietly holding his entire kingdom together, absorbing dangers he never knew existed, negotiating peace he had never realized was so fragile, saving lives that history would only ever credit to him. Why are you showing me this now? Damien asked, his voice quieter than before, stripped of the authority he usually carried so easily. Because a king should understand the true cost of his decisions, Bray said. I do not say this to shame you, my king. I say it because I have served this family for 3 generations, and I have watched kingdoms fall, not from outside enemies, but from within, when leaders forget the people who hold them together. You made your choice last night. I only ask that you make it with full knowledge of what that choice actually cost. Damien closed the ledger slowly, his hands unsteady in a way he had not felt since he was a boy first learning the weight of command. He did not speak for a long moment, staring instead at the worn leather cover, thinking of Elena's careful handwriting, thinking of 3 years he had taken almost entirely for granted. "Leave me," he said finally, and Bray, understanding that the seeds he had planted needed time to grow, bowed and departed without another word. That evening, Damien's discomfort only deepened when Serafina joined him for their first formal dinner as an engaged couple. A small, private affair, meant to allow them time to become better acquainted before the wedding preparations began in earnest. He had hoped for conversation that might ease the growing unease in his chest, perhaps some reassurance that the alliance he had sacrificed so much to secure would prove worth the cost. Instead, he found Serafina's attention focused almost entirely on matters of strategy and advantage. She asked detailed questions about the kingdom's military strength, about trade agreements with the southern pacts, about the exact boundaries of the territory her family's alliance would help secure. When Damien mentioned, almost as an afterthought, the illness spreading through the eastern barracks, Serafina's response was brief and dismissive. "Soldiers fall ill," she said, cutting a piece of meat on her plate with precise, unhurried movements. "It happens in every kingdom. Surely your healers can manage a simple fever without troubling you over dinner." "Several of my men are in serious danger," Damien said, an edge creeping into his voice that he did not entirely try to hide. Serafina glanced up at him, something cool and appraising in her expression. "Then perhaps you should have kept your previous healer close, if she was so essential to your soldiers' well-being, though I understood her departure was necessary for other reasons." The comment, delivered without malice but also without any real warmth, struck Damien harder than he expected. He said nothing further on the matter, and the rest of the dinner passed in polite but distant conversation, Serafina discussing matters of state with practiced ease, while showing no particular interest in the individual lives affected by the decisions being made around her. He found himself, later that night, comparing the evening to countless quiet dinners he had shared with Elena over the years, simple meals in the healing wing, where she would ask about his day with genuine curiosity, where she would remember small details about the people he mentioned, where her concern for his soldiers had always felt as natural and unforced as her concern for him personally. He pushed the comparison away as soon as it formed, unwilling to examine what it might mean, but the unease it left behind refused to fully disappear. The following morning brought worse news still. Garrick's fever had continued climbing through the night, despite the junior healer's best efforts, and 2 additional soldiers had shown the first signs of the same illness. The garrison commander returned to the castle, this time accompanied by a delegation of soldiers who stood at his back, their expressions carrying a quiet, unified concern that spoke louder than any words could have. "My king," the commander said, his voice steady but firm, "I must insist you reconsider. We are losing ground against this illness. Without proper intervention, I fear we may lose Garrick within days, and others may follow. I understand the circumstances of Elena's departure were complicated, but I ask you to consider the lives of the men who serve this kingdom faithfully." Damien sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the ledger he had read the previous day pressing against everything the commander now said. He thought of Garrick, a soldier he vaguely remembered from various inspections over the years, now fighting for his life because of a decision Damien had made in a moment of political calculation. He thought of the truce with the pharaoh, wondered for the first time how fragile it truly was, without Elena's continued presence to maintain the trust she had built. He thought, despite every effort not to, of her face in that hall 3 nights ago, the moment his words had landed and something had shattered behind her eyes before she composed herself and walked away without a single word of protest. "I will consider it," he said finally, though even as the words left his mouth, he was not entirely certain what such consideration would ultimately lead him to decide. The commander bowed, clearly unsatisfied, but understanding he would gain nothing further from pressing the matter that day. As the delegation departed, Damien remained alone in the throne room, the great empty space around him feeling suddenly larger and colder than it ever had before. He looked toward the doors Elena had walked through 3 nights earlier, and for the first time since making his decision, he allowed himself to wonder whether he had made a catastrophic mistake. That wondering deepened further when, later that same afternoon, a rider arrived from the eastern border, carrying news that struck an even deeper chord of alarm through the castle. The Pharaoh pack, whose fragile truce with Voss territory had held steady for 2 years, had begun making unusual movements along the shared border. Scouts reported increased patrols, a gathering of warriors near the boundary line that had not been seen since before the original conflict, and rumors circulating among border villages that the pharaoh elders questioned whether the peace agreement still held any real value, now that the person who had negotiated it was gone from the castle. Damien summoned his council immediately, and the mood in the meeting hall was grim, as advisors debated the meaning behind the pharaoh's movements. Some argued it was simple posturing, a test of the new king's resolve following his coronation. Others, including Bray, offered a more troubling interpretation. The truce was never built on treaties alone, Bray said, his voice carrying the weary authority of a man who understood politics far better than most in the room. The pharaoh elders trusted Elena personally. She spent 3 days among them, alone, earning that trust through her own conduct and courage. Treaties can be honored or broken depending on who holds power and what they believe about the intentions on the other side. If word has reached them that the woman who brokered that peace was cast aside so easily, they may reasonably wonder what value we place on agreements in general. The room fell silent at that assessment, and Damien felt the full weight of it settle over him like a physical burden. He had understood, in an abstract way, that Elena's departure might create difficulties. He had not understood, until this moment, how directly her personal relationships had underpinned the very stability he had assumed was permanent and unshakable. "What would you have me do?" Damien asked, and though the question was directed at his council broadly, his eyes settled on Bray as he spoke it. "Send emissaries to reassure the pharaoh elders that the truce remains a priority for this crown," Bray said. "But understand, my king, that reassurance from strangers carries less weight than trust built through years of personal conduct. Whatever we send, it will not carry the same weight her presence once did." Damien ordered the emissaries dispatched that very evening, though he could not shake the feeling that the gesture, however necessary, would prove insufficient against the deeper trust that had been damaged. He spent the following hours reviewing border reports with his military advisors, trying to calculate how quickly his forces could respond if the fragile peace collapsed entirely, trying to determine whether the kingdom he had inherited only days earlier could withstand a war on top of everything else now unraveling around him. By evening, further troubling news arrived from the eastern barracks. Garrick's condition had worsened, despite the junior healer's continued efforts, his fever climbing to dangerous levels that left him drifting in and out of consciousness. 2 more soldiers had developed symptoms matching the same illness, and the garrison commander sent word that without more effective treatment, he feared losing multiple men within the coming days. Damien found himself pacing the length of his private study long into the night, unable to settle his thoughts enough for sleep. Owen, his personal guard, remained stationed outside the door as always, and sometime past midnight, Damien opened the door and found the young man still standing at attention, despite the late hour. "You should rest," Damien said. "I could say the same to you, my king," Owen replied, a faint, respectful smile touching his expression, despite the gravity of recent days. Damien found himself, in a rare moment of unguarded honesty, inviting the young guard inside, rather than dismissing him for the night. Owen had served closely enough over the years to have witnessed much of what passed between Damien and Elena during quieter moments, and Damien found himself wanting, however briefly, to speak with someone who might understand the weight currently pressing on his chest. "Did you know?" Damien asked, staring into the low fire, rather than meeting Owen's eyes directly, "that she drew poison from my own blood 2 years ago, that she nearly died doing it, and told no one, and let everyone believe I had simply suffered a bout of food poisoning?" Owen was quiet for a moment before answering. "I did not know the details, my king, but I suspected something of the sort. I remember how pale she looked for a week afterward, how she refused to explain why, how she insisted on continuing her duties, despite clearly being unwell herself." Damien closed his eyes briefly, the image forming clearly now that he allowed himself to truly examine it. He remembered that week, remembered noticing her paleness in passing, remembered accepting her brief explanation of a minor illness without ever questioning it further, too consumed at the time with his own recovery to consider that hers might have been the greater sacrifice. "I told her she was not worthy of my throne," Damien said quietly, the words tasting bitter even now, 3 days after he had spoken them so easily, in front of an entire hall of witnesses. "I said it in front of everyone. I did not even give her the courtesy of a private conversation. Owen did not offer easy comfort, did not rush to reassure his king that the decision had been justified or unavoidable. He simply stood in respectful silence, allowing Damien the space to sit with the full weight of what he had done, understanding perhaps better than words could express that some mistakes required honest reckoning rather than gentle excuses. "What would you have me do now?" Damien asked, though he suspected, even as he spoke, that the young guard's answer would only confirm what some quiet, insistent part of himself had already begun to suspect. "I am only a guard, my king," Owen said carefully. "It is not my place to advise you on matters of the throne, but if you are asking what I would do, were I in your position, I would go to her. I would apologize, not with grand gestures or public spectacle, but honestly, the way she always dealt with you. And I would trust that a woman who gave 3 years of quiet devotion to this kingdom might still have room in her heart to forgive a king who finally understood the value of what he had thrown away." Damien said nothing further that night, but he did not sleep either. He sat by the dying fire long after Owen finally retired, turning the events of the past 3 days over in his mind again and again. The ledger's careful entries, the garrison commander's grim warnings, Bray's sobering assessment of the Pharaoh situation, and beneath all of it, the memory of Elena's face in that hall, the moment something had broken behind her eyes before she turned and walked away without protest. By the time dawn broke over Voss Castle, painting the stone walls in soft gray light, Damien had not yet decided what he would do. But the certainty he had carried into his coronation 3 nights earlier, the confident belief that he had made the correct decision for his kingdom's future, had crumbled entirely, replaced by a growing, undeniable understanding that he had discarded something far more valuable than he had ever allowed himself to recognize. By the 4th morning of his reign, Damien faced the full council of Voss territory, for the first time since his coronation, a gathering of pack leaders, military commanders, and senior advisors who had assembled to discuss the mounting concerns spreading through the kingdom. The atmosphere in the council chamber felt entirely different from the confident, celebratory mood of the coronation just days before. Faces around the long stone table carried tension rather than pride, and Damien understood, even before the meeting began, that this would not be an easy session. Commander Aldrich, who oversaw the kingdom's military forces, spoke first, laying out the situation along the eastern border in blunt terms that left little room for reassurance. "The Pharaoh have doubled their patrols along the boundary line. Our scouts report gatherings of warriors at 3 separate points, more than would be necessary for simple defensive posturing. If they intend to test our resolve, we must respond with strength. If they intend to test the truce itself, we may be facing renewed conflict within weeks rather than years. The emissaries I sent should reach their elders within days," Damien said, though even as he spoke the words, he heard the uncertainty in his own voice. "Emissaries carrying reassurances mean little without the trust to back them," Aldrich replied, not unkindly, but with the directness of a soldier unaccustomed to softening difficult truths. "Forgive my bluntness, my king, but the entire region understood that peace to have been built on Elena's personal conduct during those negotiations. Sending strangers to repeat promises she once made in person is unlikely to carry the same weight." A murmur ran through the gathered council, several members nodding in quiet agreement, and Damien felt the full force of collective doubt pressing against him from every direction of the table. He had expected support in his first true crisis as king. Instead, he found himself facing a room full of leaders who, however respectfully, questioned whether his decisions were steering the kingdom toward disaster rather than strength. Bray, seated near the head of the table, allowed the silence to stretch a moment longer before speaking, his weathered voice carrying the weight of decades spent navigating exactly this kind of delicate political tension. "My king, I do not say this to wound your pride, but to serve this kingdom honestly, as I have served your family for 3 generations. You inherited a stable, prosperous territory from your father, built through years of careful leadership and quiet sacrifice from many hands, not solely his own. The decision to remove Elena from her position was, whatever the political reasoning behind it, made without full understanding of what her presence actually secured for this kingdom. I do not say the alliance with Thornfield lacks value. I say only that value must be weighed honestly against what has already been lost." Damien felt heat rise in his chest, the old defensive instinct urging him to dismiss the criticism, to remind his council that the crown's decisions were not subject to open debate, simply because circumstances had grown difficult. He opened his mouth to say exactly that, to reassert his authority in the face of mounting doubt, but the words died before he could fully voice them, caught against the memory of Elena's careful ledger entries, against Owen's honest counsel the previous night, against the growing weight of evidence he could no longer ignore. "What would you have me do then?" Damien asked instead, and though the question echoed the one he had asked Owen in private, this time he directed it openly to the entire council, an admission of uncertainty that few in the room had ever heard from a Voss king. The chamber fell quiet for a long moment before Bray spoke again. "That decision remains yours alone, my king, but I would ask you to consider this. A king's strength is not measured only by the alliances he secures through marriage or the armies he commands. It is measured by the wisdom he shows in recognizing his own errors before they cost his kingdom more than it can afford to lose." The meeting continued for another hour, moving through logistical concerns, defensive preparations along the border, and the growing unrest in the eastern barracks, where 3 soldiers now lay seriously ill. But the earlier exchange hung over the remainder of the discussion, and Damien found himself listening with a different kind of attention than he had brought into the chamber that morning, weighing each concern not simply as a political problem to solve, but as a direct consequence of the choice he had made 3 nights ago. After the council dispersed, Damien remained in the chamber alone for a long while, staring at the empty seats where his advisors had sat, their concerns still echoing in his mind. He thought of his father, who had ruled for decades with a steady, measured hand, who had taught him that pride was the most dangerous weakness a king could carry, more dangerous than any external enemy. He wondered, with a discomfort he could not fully shake, whether he had already begun repeating mistakes his father had specifically warned him against. Later that afternoon, word reached him that a delegation from Thornfield had arrived unexpectedly, led by Seraphina's own father, Lord Halric, whose expression upon entering the castle carried none of the warmth expected from a man whose daughter's engagement had just been secured. Damien received him in a private audience, sensing immediately that this visit carried purposes beyond simple courtesy. "My king," Halric said, his tone carefully neutral in the way that experienced political men often adopted when delivering unwelcome news. "Word has reached Thornfield of unrest along your eastern border. My daughter's alliance with your crown was built on the understanding that Voss territory offered stability and strength. I trust these reports of renewed conflict with the Pharaoh Pack are exaggerated." "The situation is being managed," Damien said, though the careful diplomatic phrase felt hollow even as he spoke it. Halric studied him for a long moment, his sharp eyes carrying the same appraising quality Damien had noticed in Seraphina during their dinner together. "I have also heard," Halric continued, his voice dropping slightly, "that the healer who negotiated your previous truce with the Pharaoh was dismissed from your service just days before this unrest began. I do not claim to understand the full circumstances of that decision, my king, but I would advise you to consider carefully whether the timing reflects poorly on your judgment in the eyes of those observing from outside your kingdom." The comment landed with particular sharpness, not because it revealed anything Damien did not already suspect, but because it confirmed that his private crisis had already become a matter of outside scrutiny, that other kingdoms were watching, calculating, wondering whether the new Alpha King possessed the wisdom his position demanded. "I assure you, Lord Halric, this kingdom remains stable and capable of honoring every commitment made to your family," Damien said, drawing on reserves of composure he was not entirely certain he still possessed. Halric inclined his head politely, though something in his expression suggested he remained unconvinced. "I trust that is true, my king, for both our sakes." After the Thornfield lord departed, Damien sat alone in his study once more, the weight of the day pressing heavier with each passing hour. He thought of the confident young man who had stood before his coronation crowd just days earlier, certain of his own judgment, certain that pride and strategic calculation could substitute for the quieter forms of loyalty he had taken for granted throughout his life. That certainty felt entirely foreign to him now, replaced by a growing, uncomfortable awareness that he had built his first decisions as king on a foundation far less stable than he had believed. That evening, Seraphina sought him out in his study, having clearly heard of her father's visit and its uncomfortable undertones. She entered without waiting for permission, closing the door behind her with a firmness that suggested this conversation was not meant for other ears. "My father tells me your kingdom faces more difficulty than I was led to believe." she said, her earlier warmth entirely absent, replaced by the same sharp, calculating tone she had used at their first dinner together. I did not travel here to attach my family's name to instability. The situation is temporary, Damien said, though he found himself growing weary of repeating a phrase he was no longer certain he believed. Temporary situations still carry consequences, Serafina replied. If word spreads that the pharaoh no longer honor their truce with Voss territory, other kingdoms will begin to wonder whether alliances with your crown hold any lasting value. My family did not offer 3,000 warriors and control of the eastern trade routes to align ourselves with weakness. Something in her tone, cold and transactional even in the face of what should have been shared concern for their future together, struck Damien more forcefully than he expected. He studied her for a long moment, comparing, despite every effort not to, the calculating distance in her eyes to the warmth he had once taken entirely for granted in someone else's presence. "What would you have me do then?" he asked, echoing the question that seemed to follow him through every conversation these past few days. "Show strength," Serafina said simply. "Send your army to the border. Remind the pharaoh why they feared this kingdom in the first place. Diplomacy built on personal sentiment is fragile. Strength built on fear endures." Damien said nothing in response, but the suggestion settled uneasily in his chest, at odds with everything he had come to understand about how the original truce had actually been secured. Elena's peace had held for 2 years, not through fear, but through genuine trust, carefully built and carefully maintained. He wondered, as Serafina turned and left the study without waiting for his agreement, whether the alliance he had sacrificed so much to secure would ultimately offer the kingdom the strength she promised, or whether it would only replace one fragile foundation with another, built this time on intimidation rather than understanding. Later, unable to settle his mind enough for sleep, Damien walked the empty corridors of the castle alone, passing familiar rooms that felt strangely different now that he viewed them through the lens of everything he had learned in recent days. He passed the healing wing, its rooms now managed by junior healers, still struggling against an illness they lacked the experience to fully understand. He passed the training yards, where he had first seen Elena all those years ago, young and uncertain, though he had never truly understood, until now, how much strength had grown quietly behind that early uncertainty. He found himself, without entirely deciding to, standing once more outside her old room, the door still slightly ajar from Bray's visit days earlier. He stepped inside, the space nearly bare now, stripped of everything that had once made it feel lived in and warm. He ran his hand along the edge of the worn wooden table where she had prepared countless remedies over the years, and for the first time since the coronation, he allowed himself to fully feel the loss of what he had thrown away, not simply as a political miscalculation, but as something far more personal, something that had quietly anchored him through years of uncertainty, without him ever fully recognizing its value until it was gone. Ashwood Pack territory looked exactly as Elena remembered it, though something about seeing it again after 3 years away made the familiar landscape feel both comforting and strange at once. The village sat nestled in a wide valley, surrounded by rolling hills, wooden houses with smoke curling from their chimneys, fields of grain swaying gently in the afternoon breeze, and beyond it all, the deep green line of forest that had sheltered her family for generations. It was a smaller pack than Voss territory, far less wealthy, far less politically significant, but as Elena walked down the familiar dirt path toward the village center, she felt something settle in her chest that she had not felt in years. She felt, for the first time in a long while, that she was walking toward somewhere she truly belonged. Word of her arrival spread quickly, as it always did in small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. By the time she reached her family's old house at the edge of the village, a modest structure with a well-tended garden in front, her brother Corin was already standing in the doorway, having heard from a neighbor that someone matching her description had been spotted on the eastern road. Corin had grown taller since she last saw him, his shoulders broader, his face carrying the beginnings of the same steady confidence their father had always shown. He stood in the doorway for a moment, simply looking at her, taking in her travel-worn clothes and the small bag over her shoulder, and something in his expression shifted from surprise to concern, as he clearly registered that this was not the joyful reunion visit she had occasionally promised in her letters. "Elena," he said, crossing the distance between them quickly and pulling her into a firm embrace. What happened? She let herself lean into her brother's arms for a moment, feeling some of the careful composure she had maintained throughout her journey finally begin to loosen. "I'll tell you everything," she said. "But can we go inside first? I've been walking for 2 days." Corin ushered her into the house, calling for water and food, fussing over her in the gentle, slightly awkward way that younger brothers often did when trying to care for older sisters they had always looked up to. As she ate, she told him the story in careful, measured pieces, watching his expression darken with each new detail, watching his hands curl into fists on the table when she described the public nature of Damien's rejection. "He said that in front of everyone?" Corin asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "After everything you did for that kingdom?" "He doesn't know everything I did," Elena said quietly. "I never told him. I never told anyone." "That doesn't matter," Corin said. "He should have known your worth, without needing a ledger of good deeds to prove it. Any decent alpha would have seen it simply by knowing you." She appreciated his fierce loyalty, though part of her recognized the unfairness in her brother's assessment. Damien had known her, had spent years in her company, had shared some of his most vulnerable moments with her. The failure was not one of ignorance but of priorities, of allowing political calculation to outweigh years of genuine connection. She did not try to explain this nuance to Corin, sensing he was not yet ready to hear anything that might soften his righteous anger on her behalf. Word of her return reached the rest of the pack quickly, and over the following days, Elena found herself welcomed back with a warmth that surprised her, given how long she had been away. Old neighbors stopped by with small gifts of food, remembering her family's generosity over the years. Children who had been infants when she left now ran up to greet her, having heard stories from their parents about the healer's daughter, who had once mended every scraped knee and fevered brow in the village before leaving to serve a grander kingdom. Among those who came to welcome her home was Cale, a young man she had grown up alongside, the son of the pack's blacksmith, who had trained as a warrior under the Ashwood pack leader and had grown into a respected protector of the village during her years away. Elena remembered him as a somewhat awkward, earnest boy who had once followed her around during childhood summers, always eager to help with whatever task she was completing, always quick to defend her from the occasional teasing of other village children who found her interest in healing herbs strange for someone her age. The boy she remembered had grown into a tall, steady man, his shoulders broad from years of training, his expression carrying a quiet confidence that had not existed in his younger years. When he arrived at her family's door on the second day of her return, carrying a small bundle of wildflowers that he offered with an awkwardness that reminded her, briefly and warmly, of the boy she used to know, something in her chest loosened just slightly. "I heard you were back," Cale said, standing somewhat stiffly in the doorway, the flowers held out before him like an offering he was not entirely certain would be welcome. "I wanted to see for myself." "It's good to see you, Cale," Elena said, and found that she meant it genuinely, a small warmth spreading through her that felt entirely different from the complicated ache that thoughts of Voss Castle still carried. Over the following days, Cale found reasons to visit often, sometimes bringing news of the village, sometimes simply sitting with her and Corin in companionable conversation as the evenings drew in. He never pressed her for details about what had happened at Voss Castle, seeming to understand instinctively that she would share what she wished to share when she was ready, and his patience allowed her to relax in his presence in a way she had not expected to feel again so soon after everything that had happened. She began, within her first week back, to establish herself as the village's healer once more, taking over duties that had been managed haphazardly since her father's passing years before by an elderly woman who possessed only basic knowledge of remedies. Elena found genuine satisfaction in the work, treating minor injuries and illnesses among people who thanked her sincerely, who never questioned her worth based on bloodlines or political calculations, who valued her simply for the skill and care she brought to their well-being. She treated a young farmer's badly cut hand, using techniques she had refined over years of practice at Voss Castle, and watched his relief and gratitude with a warmth that reminded her why she had chosen this path in life to begin with. She helped deliver a difficult birth for a young mother in the village, drawing on knowledge she had gained treating similar complications during her years serving the larger kingdom, and felt a profound satisfaction as she placed a healthy, crying infant into the exhausted mother's arms. Each small act of healing seemed to knit something back together within her own heart as well, reminding her that her value had never truly depended on Damien's recognition, that the skills she had developed and the care she offered held meaning entirely independent of any crown or title. She began, gradually, to feel less like someone who had been discarded and more like someone who had simply found her way back to where she was always meant to be. In the evenings, after her healing duties were finished for the day, she often walked with Kale along the edges of the village, watching the sun set over the surrounding hills, talking about small, ordinary things that felt refreshingly simple after years of political complexity at Voss Castle. Kale told her about his years of training, about the small conflicts and challenges the Ashwood pack had faced in her absence, about his hopes for the pack's future, now that he had earned a respected position among its warriors. "I always wondered if you would come back," he admitted one evening, as they sat together on a low wall overlooking the fields, the sky painted in soft shades of orange and purple above them. "I know that's a strange thing to say. You had a whole life at the castle, but some part of me always hoped." Elena considered his words carefully, appreciating the honesty in them, the lack of any expectation or pressure behind the simple admission. "I think some part of me always knew I belonged here too," she said. "I just needed time to understand that on my own terms." Kale did not press further, simply nodding and allowing the comfortable silence between them to stretch on as the last light faded from the sky. She found herself, in these quiet moments, beginning to imagine a future entirely different from the one she had once envisioned at Voss Castle, a future built on genuine appreciation rather than desperate hope for recognition that might never fully come. She did not yet know that far away, at the castle she had left behind, the consequences of her absence had already begun to shake the foundations of everything Damien had believed secure. She did not know that within days, the man who had called her unworthy in front of hundreds of witnesses would begin a journey that would test everything he thought he understood about pride, duty, and the true cost of taking someone's quiet devotion for granted. On the 7th day of her return, the Ashwood pack leader, an aging but sharp-minded woman, named Idris, who had led the village for nearly 2 decades, summoned Elena to her modest hall for a formal conversation. Elena arrived uncertain what to expect, wondering whether her sudden return might be viewed as a burden on a village with limited resources, but Idris greeted her with a warmth that quickly dispelled any such worry. "Your father served this pack well for 30 years, Idris said, gesturing for Elena to sit across from her at a simple wooden table. "And from what I have already heard this week, you carry his gift, and then some. I would like to formally offer you the position of Ashwood's healer, with the full support and resources of this pack behind you." Elena felt a lump form in her throat, unexpected gratitude rising at the simple directness of the offer, so different from the careful political calculations that had governed every decision at Voss Castle. "I would be honored," she said. "Though I should tell you honestly, I left my previous position under difficult circumstances. I don't want that to reflect poorly on this pack if word travels." Idris waved a hand dismissively. "Child, I have led this pack long enough to recognize foolish pride when I hear of it, even secondhand. Whatever difficulties you faced at Voss Castle, they speak more to the character of the young king who dismissed you than to any failing on your part. This pack judges people by their actions, not by rumors carried on the wind from grander courts." The conversation eased something in Elena that she had not fully realized remained tense, some lingering worry that her dismissal from Voss Castle might follow her like a shadow, marking her as somehow less capable or less worthy in every place she went. Idris's straightforward acceptance reminded her that worth was not a universal judgment handed down by kings and crowns, but something that could be recognized differently depending on who was doing the recognizing. She threw herself into her new role over the following days, cataloging the herbs available in the surrounding forest, restocking supplies that had grown thin under the previous elderly caretaker's management, and slowly building a proper system for tracking the health needs of the village's population. The work reminded her, in the best possible way, of her earliest days learning healing from her father, before the complexities of castle politics had ever entered her life. A particular test of her skills arrived roughly 2 weeks into her return, when a traveling merchant collapsed near the village's eastern boundary, having pushed himself and his cart too hard through difficult terrain in an effort to reach Ashwood before nightfall. Kale, who had been patrolling that section of the boundary, carried the unconscious man back to the village himself, calling for Elena the moment he arrived. She worked through the night to stabilize him, recognizing quickly that exhaustion, combined with an untreated wound on his leg, had led to a dangerous fever. She drew on every technique she had ever learned, from her father's early teachings to the more advanced methods she had refined during her years at Voss Castle, and by dawn, the merchant's fever had finally broken, his breathing steady, and even for the first time since he collapsed. Cale had stayed through much of the night as well, assisting where he could, fetching water and clean cloth, watching with quiet admiration as Elena worked with a focus and skill that left little doubt about her capabilities. When the crisis finally passed and she allowed herself to rest against the wall of her small healing room, exhausted but satisfied, Cale brought her a cup of warm tea and sat beside her without speaking for a long while. "You saved his life," he finally said. Just like that, like it was nothing. "It wasn't nothing," Elena said, managing a tired smile. "It took everything I had. But that's what healing is. You give everything you have, and sometimes it's enough, and you never quite know beforehand whether it will be." Cale studied her for a moment, something thoughtful in his expression. "The kingdom you left behind is fortunate to have had you for as long as they did, even if they never fully understood what they had. This village is fortunate now." She did not know how to respond to the quiet sincerity in his words, so she simply accepted them, letting the warmth of his appreciation settle into the same place in her chest that had ached so deeply just weeks before. She thought, in that quiet moment, that perhaps healing was not only something she offered to others, but something she was slowly finding for herself as well, in the steady rhythm of a life built on genuine appreciation, rather than desperate hope for recognition that might never come. The merchant recovered fully over the following days, and before continuing his journey, he thanked Elena profusely, promising to spread word of Ashwood's skilled healer to every trading post along his route. Elena accepted his gratitude with quiet pride, understanding that her reputation, once tied entirely to her service at a grand castle, was now being rebuilt on her own terms, through her own hands, in a place that valued her fully for who she was, rather than what advantage she might bring through marriage or bloodline. As the days continued to pass, she found herself thinking of Voss Castle less frequently, the sharp ache of that public humiliation slowly softening into something more distant, more manageable. She still thought of Damien sometimes, particularly in quiet moments before sleep, wondering how he was managing the kingdom, wondering whether the truce with the pharaoh still held, wondering whether Garrick and the other soldiers she had once tended so carefully remained safe from the illness she knew could turn dangerous without proper treatment. But these thoughts came with less pain now, tinged more with the distant concern one might feel for a chapter of life that had closed, rather than the raw grief of fresh betrayal. She did not yet know how soon that chapter would reopen, how quickly the careful peace she was building in Ashwood would be interrupted by the arrival of the very man who had once told her, in front of hundreds of witnesses, that she was not worthy of standing beside his throne. The emissaries Damien sent to the pharaoh elders returned on the 6th day after Elena's departure, and the news they carried confirmed every fear that had been building within the castle walls. The pharaoh elders had received them politely but coldly, listening to reassurances about the continued value of peace between their territories, but offering no firm commitment in return. One elder, according to the emissary's report, had spoken plainly about the matter that troubled them most deeply. They said, the lead emissary explained, standing before Damien and his assembled council with visible discomfort at delivering such unwelcome news, that the peace was never truly with the crown of Voss. It was with the healer who came to them honestly, who risked her own safety to sit among them for 3 days, who spoke to their concerns with genuine understanding, rather than practiced diplomacy. They said a king who discards such loyalty so easily gives them little reason to trust his promises now. The chamber fell into heavy silence following this report, and Damien felt the full weight of consequence pressing down on him, with a force he had not fully anticipated even after days of mounting warnings. He had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that formal diplomatic gestures might be enough to preserve what Elena had built. The pharaoh's response made clear that such hope had been misplaced. That very night, as if to confirm the council's worst fears, word arrived that a border skirmish had broken out along the eastern boundary. A small group of pharaoh warriors, testing the resolve of Voss territory's defenses, had crossed into contested land and clashed with a Voss patrol. No lives had been lost, but several soldiers on both sides had suffered injuries, and the fragile peace that had held for 2 years now hung by the thinnest of threads. Damien called an emergency council session, and this time the mood in the chamber carried less doubt and more open alarm. Commander Aldrich laid out defensive preparations that would be necessary if the situation continued to escalate, describing troop movements and resource allocations that would strain the kingdom's resources even before accounting for the potential cost of actual conflict. Bray sat quietly through much of the discussion, his expression carrying the weary resignation of a man who had predicted exactly this outcome and took no satisfaction in being proven correct. "We cannot afford war on 2 fronts," Aldrich said grimly. "If the northern packs sense weakness while we're occupied defending the eastern border, we may face challenges there as well. My king, I must ask directly, is there any possibility of repairing the trust that has been damaged? Any path back to the peace that held before?" Damien sat with the question for a long moment, aware that every eye in the chamber waited for his response, aware that whatever he said next would shape the direction of his young reign in ways that might prove impossible to reverse. He thought of Elena's careful negotiations, the trust she had built through genuine personal courage rather than political calculation, and understood, with growing certainty, that no substitute diplomat could recreate what she alone had established. "I will consider every option," he said, though the words felt inadequate even as he spoke them. A king's evasion, rather than a king's decision. The council dispersed with visible frustration, several members exchanging glances that suggested their confidence in their new leader's judgment had eroded further with each passing day. Damien remained alone in the chamber long after the others had left, staring at the empty seats, feeling the full isolation of leadership pressing down on him, in a way his father had once tried to prepare him for, but that he had never truly understood until this moment. That evening, Serafina found him again, in his private study, and this time her expression carried something closer to open frustration than the cold calculation she had shown during their previous conversations. "My father sends word that Thornfield warriors have begun questioning whether this alliance still serves our interests," she said, closing the door behind her with more force than necessary. "A kingdom on the verge of war with its neighbors offers little strategic value to my family." "The situation is being managed," Damien said again, the phrase now feeling hollow and worn from overuse. "Is it?" Serafina asked, her voice sharp with an edge Damien had not heard from her before. "Because from where I stand, it appears your kingdom is unraveling, precisely because you removed the one person who held its most delicate relationships together. I do not understand why you did not simply keep her in a lesser position, some advisory role, that would not have interfered with our marriage, if her presence was truly so essential to your border security." The suggestion, delivered with such casual dismissal of the deeper complexity involved, struck Damien with unexpected force. "She was not a tool to be repositioned for convenience," he said, his voice carrying more heat than he intended. "She gave everything to this kingdom for 3 years, and I discarded her without a second thought, because I convinced myself that strategy mattered more than loyalty. That was my failure, not something that can be solved by simply finding a more convenient arrangement." Serafina studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her calculating expression. Though whether it was surprise or simple recalculation of her own position, Damien could not entirely tell. "You care for her still," she said, not quite a question. Damien did not answer immediately, the admission catching in his throat, even as he recognized, finally and fully, that it was true. He had spent days trying to convince himself that his growing unease was purely political, purely strategic, a king's concern for his kingdom's stability, rather than anything more personal. But standing in his study, faced with Serafina's blunt observation, he could no longer maintain that careful distinction. "I made a mistake," he said finally, the words carrying a weight of admission he had not allowed himself to voice fully until this moment. Not simply a political mistake, a mistake in judging what actually mattered. Serafina's expression settled into something unreadable, and she said nothing further for a long moment, simply studying him with the same careful, calculating attention she brought to every important decision. "My family did not travel here to be part of a doomed alliance built on a king's divided loyalties," she said finally. "I will speak with my father. Perhaps it is best we reconsider the terms of this arrangement, before either of our families invests further in something that may not serve either of our interests." She left without waiting for his response, and Damien remained alone in his study, the fire burning low beside him, feeling something complicated settle in his chest. Relief, perhaps, though he was reluctant to fully name it. Or perhaps simply the exhausted clarity that comes when pretense finally falls away, and truth, however uncomfortable, stands revealed in its place. He thought of the past 6 days, the mounting crises, the growing doubt among his council, the collapse of a peace that had taken years to build, and he understood, finally and completely, that he had not simply made a poor strategic calculation. He had discarded the very foundation his reign needed to succeed, choosing the appearance of strength over the substance of genuine loyalty and trust. That night, for the first time since his coronation, Damien allowed himself to fully feel the weight of what he had lost, not as an abstract political consideration, but as a deeply personal grief, for a woman whose quiet devotion he had never properly valued, until circumstances forced him to confront exactly what her absence would cost. He thought of her face in that hall, the moment his words had broken something behind her eyes, and he understood that whatever came next, whatever path forward existed for his kingdom, it would require him to reckon honestly with the pride that had led him to that catastrophic decision in the first place. The following morning brought news that deepened his resolve further. Garrick, the soldier whose fever had first signaled the danger of Elena's absence, had taken a turn for the worse overnight. The junior healers, exhausted from days of continuous effort, sent word that they had exhausted every remedy within their knowledge and feared the young soldier might not survive another day without more skilled intervention. 2 other soldiers battling the same illness showed similarly grim signs of decline. Damien went to the eastern barracks himself that morning, something he rarely did for matters of this nature, understanding that his presence alone would not change the medical realities at hand, but feeling a growing need to witness directly the consequences of his own decisions, rather than receiving them secondhand through reports and messengers. He found Garrick pale and barely conscious, his breathing shallow, sweat soaking through the thin blanket covering him despite the coolness of the room. The junior healer attending him, a young woman named Prisha who had trained under Elena during the previous outbreak, looked up with obvious exhaustion and barely concealed desperation as Damien entered. "My king," she said, rising quickly. "I have tried everything I remember from before, but the combination Elena used, I never learned it fully. She managed the worst cases personally, and I only assisted with the simpler treatments. I fear I lack the knowledge to save him." Damien looked down at Garrick's pale, sweating face, remembering vaguely the soldier from various inspections over the years, understanding now that this young man's life hung in the balance, because of choices made in a moment of political calculation that had never fully accounted for the human cost involved. He thought of Elena's careful ledger entries, the meticulous records of treatments and outcomes that Bray had shown him, and he wondered whether those records might contain the exact knowledge Prisha now lacked. "Send for Bray," he said. Immediately. Bray arrived within the hour, carrying Elena's ledger as Damien had requested, and together with Prisha, they searched through the careful entries for any record of the specific treatment used during the previous outbreak. They found it eventually, a detailed description of a rare combination of herbs that grew only in certain parts of the forest surrounding Voss territory, herbs that required careful preparation to avoid worsening the very fever they were meant to treat. "I know where these grow," Prisha said, studying the entry with renewed hope. "I can gather them myself, but the preparation method described here, I've never attempted anything this precise before. If I make an error in the proportions, it could do more harm than good." Damien felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him, understanding that Garrick's life now depended on a treatment method that only Elena herself had ever successfully executed. He thought of sending for her directly, of swallowing whatever remained of his pride and requesting her return to save a soldier's life. But something in him still hesitated, some final remnant of stubbornness that resisted fully admitting the depth of his error, even in the face of a young man's suffering. "Do your best," he told Prisha instead. "Follow the instructions as precisely as you can. I will remain here to assist however I'm able." Prisha nodded and hurried off to gather the necessary herbs, and Damien remained beside Garrick's bedside for the following hours, watching the young soldier's labored breathing, feeling every minute stretch with mounting tension. Bray remained as well, saying little, but his presence carrying a quiet, steady support that Damien found himself grateful for despite the discomfort of the older advisor witnessing his growing desperation so directly. "You could send for her," Bray said finally, breaking the long silence between them. "There is no shame in it, my king, only wisdom in recognizing what your kingdom truly needs." Damien did not answer immediately, his eyes fixed on Garrick's pale face, on the shallow rise and fall of his chest, on the visible evidence of exactly how much damage his pride had already caused. "I know," he said finally, quietly. "I know I should. I am simply trying to understand how to face her again, after everything I said." "That understanding will not come from waiting," Bray said. "It will come from action, from humility, from finally placing your kingdom's true needs above whatever pride still holds you back." Prisha returned as the sun began to set, carrying the carefully prepared remedy, and administered it to Garrick, with hands that trembled slightly despite her best efforts at composure. They waited through a long, tense hour as the treatment took effect, watching for any sign of improvement, or, more frightening, any sign that the preparation had gone wrong. Slowly, gradually, Garrick's breathing began to steady, his fever finally showing the first small signs of breaking, and by the time full darkness had fallen over the barracks, the immediate crisis had, for the moment, been averted. But the relief Damien felt was tempered by the clear understanding that this had been a narrow escape, one that had depended on incomplete records and a young healer's desperate improvisation rather than any true solution to the deeper problem. 2 other soldiers still battled the same illness. The Pharaoh border remained tense and unresolved. The alliance with Thornfield now hung in uncertain balance, and the woman whose knowledge and presence had once held all of these threads together remained days away, in a village he had never visited, having been told by his own voice that she was not worthy of standing beside his throne. As he finally left the barracks that night, walking alone through the quiet castle grounds beneath a sky full of distant stars, Damien understood with complete and undeniable clarity that half measures and careful diplomatic gestures would not be enough to repair what his pride had broken. Something more would be required. Something that would demand far more from him than any political calculation ever had. 2 days after Garrick's fever finally broke, the young soldier had recovered enough strength to sit up in his bed and receive visitors, and word reached Damien that Garrick had specifically requested an audience with the king, a request unusual enough coming from a common soldier that Damien found himself genuinely curious about what the young man wished to say. He arrived at the barracks in the early afternoon, finding Garrick propped against a stack of pillows, still pale but clearly on the mend, his eyes carrying a sharp alertness that suggested he had been waiting with purpose for this conversation. Damien dismissed the guards who normally accompanied him on such visits, sensing that whatever Garrick wished to discuss required privacy. "My king," Garrick said, struggling slightly to sit up straighter despite his lingering weakness. "Thank you for coming. I understand you were present the night my fever finally broke. I wish to thank you personally." "You have Prisha and Bray to thank for that, more than me," Damien said. "I merely stood by while others did the difficult work." Garrick studied him for a moment, something thoughtful in his expression. "Perhaps, but I understand it was you who sent for Bray, who authorized the use of Elena's records to find the treatment that saved my life. That matters, my king, even if it feels small to you." Damien said nothing, uncertain how to respond to gratitude that felt only partially deserved, and Garrick continued, his voice growing more serious. "I asked to speak with you today, because there is something I believe you should know, something Elena never told anyone outside a small circle of soldiers who witnessed it directly, myself included. I do not know if she would want this shared, but I believe you deserve to understand the full truth of what she gave to this kingdom before you make any further decisions about her place in it." Damien felt something tighten in his chest, sensing that whatever Garrick was about to reveal would deepen the guilt he already carried, but he nodded for the young soldier to continue. 2 years ago, Garrick began, during the height of the tension with the Pharaoh, before the truce was fully secured, you traveled to the border yourself for a preliminary meeting with their war leaders. Do you remember this? Damien nodded slowly, the memory surfacing with growing unease. I remember. It was meant to establish initial terms before the formal negotiations began. What you may not know, Garrick continued, is that the meeting was compromised. A faction within the Pharaoh leadership, opposed to any peace with Voss territory, planned an ambush during that meeting, intending to kill you and reignite the conflict permanently, believing that eliminating you would throw this kingdom into enough chaos to make conquest easier. Elena discovered the plot 2 days before the meeting, through contacts she had cultivated among sympathetic Pharaoh villagers during her early diplomatic efforts. Damien felt his blood run cold, a memory he had never fully understood suddenly gaining terrible new context. He remembered that meeting, remembered an unexpected skirmish that had broken out just as the discussions began, remembered his own guards moving quickly to protect him, remembered later being told simply that hostile elements had attempted to disrupt the peace talks. He had never known the full scope of what had actually occurred. She could not warn you directly, without revealing her sources, and endangering the villagers who had trusted her with the information, Garrick continued. Instead, she arranged for a small group of soldiers, myself included, to accompany your official guard in secret, positioned to intercept the ambush before it could reach you. She insisted on coming herself as well, despite every argument we made against it, saying she needed to be present in case anyone was wounded, saying she could not in good conscience send others into danger without sharing that risk herself. Damien's chest tightened further as Garrick continued, the young soldier's voice carrying the weight of a memory, clearly still vivid, despite the passage of time. The ambush came exactly as she predicted, though earlier than expected, catching some of our positioning still incomplete. In the chaos, one of the Pharaoh warriors broke through our line and came directly for you, my king, faster than any of your official guard could respond. Elena was the only one close enough to intervene. She threw herself between you and his blade, taking a wound meant for your throat across her own shoulder instead. The memory Damien had carried for 2 years, incomplete and misunderstood, suddenly shattered and reformed with devastating clarity. He remembered, now, a moment of chaos and blood, remembered Elena appearing suddenly at his side, remembered being pulled away by his guards before he fully understood what had happened, remembered being told later that the situation had been contained without serious injury to anyone important. He had never known that Elena herself had been the one seriously injured, had never understood that she had physically placed herself between him and a blade meant to end his life. She nearly died that day, Garrick said quietly. The wound was deep, dangerously close to vital arteries in her shoulder. She treated it herself, refusing to let anyone else near the injury, insisting that the official story remained simply that the ambush had been repelled, without significant casualties. She did not want you to know, my king, she said, and I remember her words exactly, because they struck me so deeply at the time, that a king should never carry the weight of knowing someone bled to save him, because that weight would only distract him from the duties his kingdom needed him to fulfill. Damien sat in stunned silence, the full weight of Garrick's revelation settling over him like a physical force. He had spent 3 years believing Elena's devotion, however deep, existed within the reasonable boundaries of duty and friendship. He had never understood, until this exact moment, that she had literally placed her body between him and death, had nearly sacrificed her own life to preserve his, and had then deliberately hidden that sacrifice from him, specifically, so he would not feel burdened by the knowledge. "Why are you telling me this now?" Damien finally managed to ask, his voice rough with emotions he struggled to fully articulate. "Because I watched you dismiss her in that hall," Garrick said, his own voice carrying a controlled but unmistakable edge of anger. "I watched you call her unworthy of your throne, when in truth, my king, she is the reason you still have a throne to sit upon at all. I have said nothing until now, because it was not my secret to share, and because I respected her wish to keep the truth hidden. But watching this kingdom unravel these past days, watching soldiers I care about suffer because her knowledge and presence were removed so carelessly, I decided you needed to understand the full truth before you made any further decisions that might permanently close the door on repairing what was broken." Damien sat with the weight of this revelation for a long moment, unable to speak, his mind cycling through every memory of Elena he possessed, reframing each one through this new understanding of exactly how much she had sacrificed, and how carefully she had hidden that sacrifice out of love, rather than any desire for recognition or reward. He thought of the scar he had noticed once, years ago, along her shoulder, and how she had brushed off his question about its origin with a vague explanation about an old training accident. He had never questioned it further, never understood that he was looking at evidence of a wound she had taken to save his life. "I told her she was not worthy of my throne," Damien said quietly, more to himself than to Garrick, the full horror of that public declaration finally landing with its complete weight. She bled for me, nearly died for me, and I stood in front of hundreds of witnesses and told her she was not worthy. Garrick said nothing further, allowing the silence to carry its own judgment, and Damien found himself rising slowly from his seat beside the young soldier's bed, understanding that whatever comfortable justifications he had constructed for his decision had finally, completely, collapsed under the weight of a truth he could no longer avoid. "Thank you for telling me this," Damien said finally. "I know it was not easy to share, and I know it does not change what has already been done, but I needed to understand the full truth." "What will you do now, my king?" Garrick asked, his earlier anger softening slightly into something more like cautious hope. Damien stood at the doorway of the barracks room for a long moment before answering, staring out toward the horizon where, somewhere many miles distant, Elena had built a new life, in a village he had never bothered to visit, among people who valued her for exactly who she was, rather than the political calculations she might enable. "What I should have done from the beginning," he said finally. "I am going to go to her myself." He left the barracks with a clarity of purpose he had not felt since before his coronation, understanding now with complete certainty that no emissary, no formal apology delivered through intermediaries, no careful diplomatic gesture would be sufficient to address what he had done. He needed to face her directly, to speak the truth of his failure with his own voice, the same voice that had so carelessly declared her unworthy in front of everyone who mattered to his reign. He returned to the castle and immediately summoned Bray, finding the old advisor in his usual study, surrounded by scrolls and ledgers detailing the kingdom's ongoing concerns. Bray looked up as Damien entered, something in the young king's expression clearly signaling that a decision had finally been made. "I am going to find her," Damien said without preamble. "I am going to Ashwood, personally, to speak with her directly." Bray studied him for a long moment, and something like relief passed across his weathered features. "It is about time, my king, though I must ask, are you prepared for the possibility that she may refuse to hear you, that the damage done may prove too deep for any apology to fully repair?" "I don't know," Damien admitted honestly, "but I understand now that I must try, regardless of the outcome. I owe her that much, even if she never forgives me." "What of the kingdom in your absence?" Bray asked. "The Pharaoh situation remains unresolved. The Thornfield alliance hangs in uncertain balance. Your council will need guidance." "I trust you and Aldrich to manage matters until my return," Damien said. "This is something I must handle myself, and quickly, before I lose whatever small chance remains to make things right." Bray nodded slowly, understanding settling into his expression. "Then go, my king, and when you find her, I would ask only one thing. Speak to her honestly, without the careful diplomatic language you have relied on your entire life. She has always valued honesty above eloquence. Do not fail her again by offering polished words instead of genuine truth." Damien left the study with those words echoing in his mind, understanding that Bray's counsel carried more wisdom than perhaps any political strategy he might have devised on his own. He returned to his chambers to prepare for the journey ahead, his thoughts consumed entirely by the weight of what Garrick had revealed, by the growing understanding of exactly how much Elena had sacrificed for a kingdom, and a king, who had ultimately repaid her devotion with public humiliation. Before he could depart, however, Damien understood there was one more difficult conversation he needed to complete. He found Serafina in the castle's private garden, walking alone among the late autumn flowers, her expression thoughtful in a way that suggested she too had been turning over recent events in her mind. "I am leaving the castle for several days," Damien said, approaching her directly, rather than easing into the conversation with the careful diplomatic language he might once have relied upon. "I am traveling to Ashwood to speak with Elena." Serafina turned to face him fully, studying his expression with the same sharp attention she brought to every important negotiation. "I see," she said simply. "And what do you intend to say to her, once you arrive?" "The truth," Damien said, "that I was wrong. That pride led me to discard someone whose worth I never properly understood, and whose sacrifice for this kingdom went far beyond anything I ever acknowledged." Serafina considered this for a long moment, and something in her composed expression softened slightly, though whether from genuine understanding or simple pragmatic recalculation, Damien could not entirely determine. My father has already begun drafting terms to formally withdraw our family's proposed alliance, she said. I suspect he sensed, even before I did, that this arrangement was built on unstable ground from the very beginning. I am sorry for the disruption this causes your family, Damien said, and found that he meant it sincerely, despite everything that had passed between them. You deserve a partnership built on genuine commitment, not one entered into as a political calculation, while my heart remained elsewhere, even if I did not fully understand that truth myself at the time. Serafina's expression carried something almost like respect as she studied him. That is more honesty than I expected from you, my king. So perhaps there is hope for your reign yet, if you can learn to lead with that same honesty going forward. She paused, glancing toward the castle gates. I wish you success in your journey, whatever the outcome may be. A kingdom led by a man honest enough to admit his failures is, I suspect, stronger in the long run than one built on alliances of convenience. They parted on terms far more amicable than Damien had expected, and as she walked back toward the castle to begin preparations for her own departure, he felt a strange, unexpected lightness settle over him, the sense of one obligation honestly concluded, freeing him to focus entirely on the far more difficult reconciliation that awaited him at the end of his journey. That night, Damien called his full council together one final time before departing, explaining plainly his intention to travel to Ashwood personally, and his reasons for doing so. He watched relief pass across several faces in the chamber, understanding that his advisors had been waiting, in their own careful ways, for exactly this kind of honest reckoning from their young king. The Thornfield alliance has been withdrawn by mutual agreement, he told them. I understand this creates additional uncertainty for our kingdom's strategic position, and I take full responsibility for the circumstances that led to this outcome. In my absence, I ask Bray and Commander Aldrich to manage the kingdom's affairs, to continue defensive preparations along the eastern border, and to seek whatever peaceful resolution with the Pharaoh remains possible. And when you return, my king? Aldrich asked. What then, if Elena refuses to hear you, or refuses to return even if she does? Damien considered the question carefully before answering, understanding that his response mattered not simply for the immediate political calculation involved, but for the deeper question of what kind of king he intended to become going forward. Then I will have at least offered the honest apology she deserves, regardless of the outcome, and this kingdom will need to find its path forward through other means, built on whatever lessons I can carry forward from this experience, about the true cost of pride and the true value of loyalty freely given, rather than politically calculated. The council dispersed with a quiet, cautious respect that Damien had not felt from them since before his coronation, and he retired to his chambers that night to prepare for the journey ahead, his mind consumed entirely by everything Garrick had revealed, by the growing understanding of exactly how much Elena had sacrificed, and by the uncertain hope that somewhere at the end of the long road to Ashwood, there might still exist a chance to make things right. Damien left Voss Castle before dawn the following morning, choosing to travel with only Owen accompanying him, rather than the full guard contingent that would normally escort a king beyond his own borders. He understood the risk in this decision, understood that his advisors would have preferred a larger, more cautious approach, given the tensions along the eastern border, but something in him needed this journey to feel different from the political calculations that had governed every other decision of his young reign. This needed to feel personal, stripped of royal spectacle, closer to the honest reckoning he owed the woman he was traveling to find. The first day of travel passed in relative ease, the road familiar enough from years of occasional diplomatic journeys through the region, though Damien found himself seeing the passing landscape with new eyes, noticing details he had always overlooked during previous travels, focused entirely on destinations and objectives, rather than the journey itself. He noticed small villages where children waved as his horse passed, farmers tending fields that fed his kingdom, ordinary lives continuing, regardless of the political dramas unfolding within his castle walls. He wondered, as he rode, how many of these ordinary people had been touched in some quiet way by Elena's healing skills over the years, how many owed their continued health, or their children's survival, to knowledge she had shared freely, without any expectation of recognition. By the second day, the terrain grew more difficult, the well-maintained roads near Voss Castle giving way to rougher paths as they moved further from the kingdom's center, toward the smaller, less politically significant territories that included Ashwood. Owen rode alongside him mostly in comfortable silence, understanding instinctively that his king needed space to process the weight of thoughts clearly occupying his mind, though occasionally he offered quiet observations that helped ease the growing tension Damien carried. "You seem different than you did, even a week ago, my king," Owen said, as they made camp for the second night, the fire crackling low between them, beneath a canopy of stars, far more visible here than within the castle's walls. More thoughtful, perhaps, less certain of easy answers. "I have learned, painfully, how much certainty can cost when it is not built on genuine understanding," Damien said, staring into the flames. "I spent years believing my judgment was sound, simply because I held the title of king, first as heir, now as ruler. I never fully understood how much of my success actually depended on people whose contributions I took entirely for granted." Owen nodded slowly, adding another branch to the fire. "My father used to say that true leadership is not about never making mistakes, but about how quickly and honestly you correct them once you recognize them. Perhaps this journey is your chance to prove that lesson true." The third day of travel brought unexpected difficulty, when their path led through a narrow mountain pass, known to harbor occasional bandit activity, a route Damien had chosen, specifically because it offered the fastest passage toward Ashwood territory, despite its risks. Midway through the pass, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the rocky terrain, a small group of armed men emerged from concealment among the boulders, clearly intent on robbing whatever travelers happened to pass through their territory. Damien and Owen found themselves quickly surrounded, 5 bandits blocking their path forward, while the narrow terrain made retreat equally difficult. Damien's hand moved instinctively to the sword at his side, years of training taking over, despite the surprise of the ambush, and for a tense moment, it seemed a violent confrontation was unavoidable. "We want nothing more than your horses and whatever coin you carry," the apparent leader of the group said, his weapon raised, but his tone carrying more calculation than genuine bloodlust. "Cooperate, and no one need be harmed." Damien considered his options quickly, understanding that engaging in unnecessary conflict would only delay his journey further, potentially risking Owen's safety over resources that mattered little compared to his true purpose. "Take the coin," he said, gesturing for Owen to lower his own weapon, despite the younger man's clear reluctance. "We have urgent business that cannot be delayed by further conflict." The bandit leader studied him for a moment, something in Damien's calm, direct manner, clearly unexpected from a traveler in such vulnerable circumstances. "You speak with unusual confidence, for a man surrounded and outnumbered," he observed. "I have learned recently that pride, misapplied, costs far more than any coin you might take from me today," Damien said. "I am traveling to correct a mistake that has already cost my kingdom dearly. I would rather lose these resources than lose more time, on a journey that matters more than any of us fully understand." Something in this response seemed to shift the bandit leader's calculation, his expression flickering with what might have been curiosity, or perhaps grudging respect. "A strange thing to hear from a man dressed as well as you are," he said. "Very well. Leave the coin and continue your journey. We have no interest in delaying a man on urgent business, whatever that business might be." Damien removed the pouch of coin from his belt and tossed it to the ground before the bandit leader, and the group allowed them to pass without further incident, disappearing back into the rocky terrain as quickly as they had appeared. Owen remained tense for some time after the encounter, glancing back frequently to ensure they were not being followed, but Damien found himself strangely unshaken by the confrontation, his mind still consumed primarily by thoughts of the conversation awaiting him at the end of this journey. "You handled that with remarkable composure, my king," Owen said, once they had put sufficient distance between themselves and the mountain pass. "I expected we might need to fight our way through. A week ago, I likely would have insisted on exactly that," Damien admitted. "My pride would have demanded I prove my strength, rather than simply accept a practical loss to preserve what actually mattered. I am learning, slowly and painfully, which battles are worth fighting, and which simply waste time and risk that could be better spent elsewhere." They continued their journey through difficult terrain for the remainder of that day, finally reaching easier roads as they crossed into the territories bordering Ashwood's lands. Damien found himself growing increasingly restless as they drew closer to their destination, his mind cycling endlessly through the words he intended to say, the apology he needed to offer, the uncertainty of how Elena might receive him after everything that had happened. That evening, as they made camp for what Owen estimated would be their final night, before reaching Ashwood the following day, Damien found himself unable to settle into easy sleep, despite the physical exhaustion of days of hard travel. He sat by the fire long after Owen had drifted off, staring into the flames, rehearsing words that felt inadequate no matter how he arranged them, understanding that no careful speech could fully address the depth of what he needed to acknowledge. He thought of Garrick's account of the ambush, of Elena throwing herself between him and a blade meant for his throat, of the scar she had carried in silence for 2 years, rather than burden him with the knowledge of her sacrifice. He thought of the Pharaoh negotiations, 3 days spent alone, among people who had every reason to want her dead, risking everything to secure a peace that he had then allowed to crumble through careless pride. He thought of 3 years of quiet devotion, culminating in a public rejection, delivered without even the basic courtesy of a private conversation. He understood, sitting alone beneath the stars on the final night before reaching her, that whatever words he found tomorrow would need to carry the full weight of genuine remorse, rather than polished diplomatic language. Bray's counsel echoed in his mind. She had always valued honesty above eloquence. He would need to strip away every careful, calculated instinct that had governed his behavior as a king, and speak instead as simply a man who had made a devastating mistake and finally understood its true cost. Sleep, when it finally came, brought fragmented dreams of that crowded hall, of Elena's face in the moment his words had broken something behind her eyes, of her walking away without protest, into a darkness he had never bothered to follow until it was almost too late. He woke before dawn, the weight of the coming day settling over him immediately, and roused Owen for the final stretch of their journey toward Ashwood, toward whatever reckoning awaited him there. They passed through a small trading post shortly after sunrise, the same cluster of wooden stalls Elena had passed on her own journey days earlier, and Damien found himself stopping briefly to water the horses, while Owen inquired about the remaining distance to Ashwood. The merchant Callum, recognizing neither of them as anything other than ordinary travelers given their plain riding clothes and lack of royal banners, mentioned casually that a skilled healer had recently settled in the village ahead, already earning a strong reputation throughout the surrounding region for her remarkable skill. "Saved a merchant's life just last week, from what I've heard," Callum said, adjusting a roll of cloth on his stall. "Fever and infection that should have killed him by all rights. Word travels fast about a healer that good. Folks are already talking about her as far as 2 villages over." Damien felt something tighten in his chest at this unexpected confirmation that Elena had already begun rebuilding her life, already begun earning the recognition and respect that had eluded her at his own castle despite years of far greater sacrifice. Part of him felt a strange, complicated pride at hearing her praised by a stranger who had no idea of the connection between them. Another part felt the sharp sting of understanding just how quickly and completely she had moved forward without him, how little his absence from her new life seemed to matter to the community that had already embraced her so warmly. "She sounds remarkable," Owen said carefully, glancing toward Damien to gauge his reaction. "She is," Damien said simply, and said nothing further as they remounted their horses and continued toward Ashwood, the trading post disappearing behind them as the road wound deeper into unfamiliar territory. The landscape shifted gradually as they traveled, the terrain growing gentler, rolling hills replacing the rockier ground they had crossed the previous day, fields of grain visible in the distance where Ashwood's farmers tended their crops beneath the midday sun. Damien found his nervousness growing with each passing mile, a sensation entirely unfamiliar to a man who had faced armed bandits just 2 days earlier, with far greater composure than he now felt approaching a simple village to speak with a woman he had once called unworthy of his throne. "You seem troubled, my king," Owen observed, as they crested a final hill that revealed Ashwood's valley spread out below them, wooden houses and smoke curling from chimneys visible in the distance. "I have faced armies with less trepidation than I feel now," Damien admitted, reining his horse to a brief stop as he took in the sight of the village where Elena had rebuilt her life. "There is no strategy for this conversation, no careful diplomatic language that will guarantee the outcome I hope for. I can only offer honesty and hope it proves enough, though I understand it may not." "Then that is precisely what you must do," Owen said simply. "Whatever the outcome, my king, I believe she will recognize the difference between the man who spoke those cruel words in that hall and the man who rode 3 difficult days to stand before her and admit he was wrong." Damien nodded slowly, drawing what strength he could from Owen's steady confidence, and together they began their descent into the valley, toward the village where Elena had found the peace and recognition that his own kingdom had so carelessly denied her, toward a conversation that would determine not simply the fate of a fragile political alliance, but the deeper question of whether genuine remorse, arriving after devastating loss, could ever fully repair what pride had broken. Elena was tending to an elderly villager's aching joints in her small healing room when Cale appeared in the doorway, his expression carrying an urgency that immediately drew her attention away from her work. "Elena," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled surprise. "There are riders approaching from the northern road. One of them, I believe, is the Alpha King of Voss." The words landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, and for a moment she simply stood frozen, her hands still holding the small jar of salve she had been preparing. 3 days had passed since her family's warm welcome had settled into the comfortable rhythm of her new life. 3 days of healing and quiet peace that had begun to feel like they might stretch into a genuine future, free from the shadow of Voss Castle. She had not expected, had perhaps not allowed herself to even imagine, that Damien might follow her here. "Are you certain?" she asked, setting the jar down carefully, despite the tremor she felt building in her hands. "I served in a border patrol 2 years ago, and saw him from a distance during a diplomatic escort," Cale said. "I am as certain as I can be without seeing him directly. He rides with only one companion, no royal banner, no full guard. Whatever brings him here, it does not appear to be a formal state visit." Elena finished the elderly villager's treatment with hands that remained steady despite the storm building inside her, and thanked the old woman for her patience, before finally allowing herself to step outside into the afternoon light. Word of the approaching riders had already begun spreading through the village, curious faces appearing in doorways and along the main path, and by the time Elena reached the village center, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the unusual sight of unfamiliar travelers approaching their quiet community. She watched the 2 riders draw closer, and even from a distance, she recognized Damien immediately, the familiar set of his shoulders, the way he sat his horse, with the unconscious confidence of someone who had ridden since childhood. Something in her chest tightened painfully at the sight of him, a complicated tangle of anger, hurt, and, despite every effort to deny it, a lingering ache of feelings she had not fully managed to extinguish, despite everything that had happened. Damien dismounted at the edge of the village center, and for a long moment, the 2 of them simply stood, facing each other, across a distance of perhaps 20 feet, the gathered villagers watching with curious, uncertain attention, sensing that whatever unfolded here carried weight beyond a simple visit from a neighboring kingdom's ruler. "Elena," Damien said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet gathering, stripped of any royal formality, sounding instead simply like a man who had traveled far and carried something heavy he needed to set down. "I know I have no right to ask for your time, but I am asking anyway." She said nothing for a long moment, studying him, noting the travel-worn state of his clothes, the exhaustion visible in his features, so different from the polished, confident king who had stood before his coronation crowd just days earlier. "You traveled a long way to say very little, my king," she said finally, her voice carrying a controlled coolness that masked the turmoil beneath. "I did not travel this far to say little," Damien said. "I traveled this far because what I need to say deserves to be spoken in person, not through messengers, not through careful diplomatic language. I was wrong, Elena, wrong in ways I did not fully understand, until circumstances forced me to confront them." The gathered crowd remained silent, watching the exchange with growing understanding that this conversation carried the weight of something deeply personal, and Elena felt heat rise in her chest. 3 days of hard-won peace, suddenly threatened by the return of every painful emotion she had worked so carefully to set aside. "You called me unworthy of your throne," she said, her voice finally cracking slightly with the emotion she had held carefully in check. "In front of hundreds of witnesses, you did not even offer me the courtesy of a private conversation, before discarding 3 years of everything I gave to your kingdom." "I know," Damien said, taking a step closer, though he stopped himself when he saw her posture stiffen further, respecting the distance she clearly needed to maintain. "I know, and I have no excuse that would make that cruelty acceptable. I convinced myself that political calculation mattered more than genuine loyalty, more than everything you had given so quietly, so selflessly, for years. I was wrong about all of it. Do you even understand what you took from me? Elena asked, her composure finally beginning to crack fully, years of careful restraint giving way to raw honesty in front of the gathered village. I gave everything to your kingdom. I nearly died drawing poison from your own blood, and I never told you, because I did not want you to carry that burden. I spent 3 days alone among the pharaoh, risking my life to secure a peace I never asked for recognition for. I bled for you, Damien. I threw myself between you and a blade meant for your throat, and I hid that scar for 2 years, because I did not want my sacrifice to become a weight you carried, rather than a gift I gave freely. Damien's expression crumbled at her words, the confirmation of everything Garrick had revealed, landing with devastating force, even though he had already known the truth. I learned of the ambush only days ago, he said quietly. Garrick told me everything. I did not know, Elena. I swear to you, I did not know the full extent of what you sacrificed, until it was almost too late to understand it. And would it have mattered? She asked, her voice trembling now with barely controlled emotion. Would knowing have changed what you said in that hall? Or would you have simply found some other justification for discarding me the moment a more advantageous option appeared? The question hung in the air between them, sharp and unforgiving, and Damien took a long moment before answering, understanding that his response here mattered more than any careful political calculation he had ever made. I do not know, he admitted honestly, refusing to offer easy reassurance that might ring hollow, given everything that had happened. I want to believe that knowing would have changed everything. But I understand now that the deeper failure was not simply ignorance of your sacrifices, it was allowing pride and political calculation to matter more than the value of genuine loyalty, regardless of whether I fully understood every detail of what that loyalty had cost you. Elena felt tears building, despite her best efforts to hold them back. The raw honesty in his admission, cutting through her carefully maintained anger, in ways that polished excuses never could have. 3 years, Damien, she said, her voice breaking slightly. 3 years of everything I gave, and it took your entire kingdom nearly collapsing before you understood my worth. You are right to be angry, Damien said, taking another careful step closer. Close enough now that she could see the genuine anguish written across his features, so different from the cold, distant expression he had worn in that crowded hall. You are right to question whether any apology now can undo what I did. I cannot promise you that it can. I can only tell you the truth, standing here in front of everyone who matters to your new life, exactly as I should have honored you before everyone who mattered to my old one. You are not unworthy of my throne, Elena. You never were. I was unworthy of your loyalty, and I am asking, with no guarantee that I deserve an answer, whether there is any way forward from here. The village center had grown utterly silent, every villager present understanding they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple visit, and Elena stood at the center of it, torn between 3 years of accumulated hurt and the undeniable weight of genuine remorse she could see written across every line of Damien's exhausted, travel-worn face. She glanced, almost involuntarily, toward Cale, who stood near the edge of the crowd, his expression carefully neutral despite the tension clearly visible in his posture, understanding perhaps better than anyone present exactly what this moment might mean for the quiet future he had begun to hope for alongside her. She thought of her family's warmth, of Idris's genuine welcome, of the peace she had found in healing her own people, without the constant political calculation that had governed every relationship at Voss Castle. And she thought, too, of 3 years of genuine connection with Damien, before that final devastating night, of quiet conversations that had once felt like the truest form of love she had ever known, of a man who, despite everything, had just traveled 3 difficult days to stand before her and speak with a raw honesty she had never expected to hear from him again. I need time, she said finally, her voice steadier now, though still carrying the weight of unresolved emotion. You cannot simply arrive after 3 days and expect 3 years of hurt to disappear because you finally understand what you threw away. I need time to decide what I actually want, separate from your need for forgiveness. Damien nodded slowly, understanding settling into his exhausted features, and something in his posture suggested he had expected exactly this response. had perhaps hoped for nothing more than the chance to speak his apology honestly, and allow her the space to decide its meaning on her own terms. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I will not press you further, will not return again to press my case, unless you choose to send for me yourself. I came only to say what I should have said days ago, to make clear that whatever happens next, you were never unworthy. I was the one who failed to recognize your true worth until it was almost too late to matter." He turned then, moving to remount his horse, but before he could climb into the saddle, Idris stepped forward from among the gathered villagers, her aged but authoritative voice carrying easily across the quiet square. "My king," she said, and though the title carried respect, her tone held nothing of deference. "Before you depart, I would ask that you understand something about the woman you traveled here to see." Damien turned back, his expression attentive despite his obvious exhaustion. Idris continued, her sharp eyes studying him carefully. "This village welcomed Elena back, not because of any castle she once served, or any title she once held, but because of who she is at her core. She heals, without asking whether the wounded deserve her care. She gives, without calculating what return she might receive. That is not a quality found in someone unworthy of any throne. It is precisely the quality that makes a throne worth sitting upon in the first place." "I understand that now," Damien said quietly, "perhaps more fully than I understand almost anything else in my life." "Then understand also," Idris continued, "that whatever decision she reaches, it must be hers alone, made without pressure, from either your kingdom's needs or this village's growing affection for her. She has earned the right to choose her own path, free from anyone else's expectations, including yours." Damien bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement, a gesture of respect Elena had rarely seen him offer to anyone outside his own council. "I would not have it any other way," he said. "I have learned, painfully, the cost of making decisions about her life without her voice guiding them. I will not repeat that mistake." With that, he finally mounted his horse, and Owen followed suit beside him. Before turning to leave, Damien looked once more toward Elena, and something passed between them that words could not fully capture. 3 years of shared history, compressed into a single, lingering glance, carrying both apology and hope in equal measure. "I will be at the small inn along the northern road," he said quietly, loud enough only for her to hear. "For as long as it takes, whether that is a day or a week, I will wait, without pressing you further, until you decide whether you wish to speak with me again." He turned his horse and rode away from the village center, Owen following close behind, and Elena remained standing where she was for a long moment, watching until the two riders disappeared over the same hill they had crested just an hour before. The gathered villagers slowly began to disperse, murmuring quietly among themselves, though several cast sympathetic glances toward Elena as they returned to their daily tasks, understanding, without needing further explanation, that she carried a heavy weight now that required careful, private processing. Cale approached her slowly once the crowd had mostly cleared, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of concern and something more guarded beneath it. "Are you all right?" he asked simply. "I don't know," Elena admitted, the honesty of the answer surprising even herself. "I thought I had made peace with everything that happened. I thought I had moved past needing anything from him. And then he stood there and said exactly the things I once hoped, desperately, to hear from him, and I don't know what to feel anymore." Cale was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words with care. "You don't owe him an answer simply because he traveled here and offered an apology, however sincere it seemed," he said. "Whatever you decide, take the time you need. This village, myself included, will support you regardless of what path you choose." Elena appreciated the careful restraint in his words, understanding the effort it must have cost him to offer support, without revealing the hope he clearly carried for a different outcome, one where she remained in Ashwood, where the future they had begun quietly building together might continue to grow. She reached out and squeezed his hand gently, a gesture of gratitude that carried no promise beyond simple appreciation for his steady presence. "Thank you, Cale," she said. "I need to think, alone, if that's all right." He nodded and stepped back, allowing her the space she requested, and Elena walked slowly toward the edge of the village, toward the same low wall overlooking the fields where she and Cale had spent so many quiet evenings in recent weeks, needing now to simply sit with everything that had unfolded, without the weight of anyone else's presence or expectations shaping her thoughts. She sat there long into the evening, watching the sun sink below the distant hills, turning over every word Damien had spoken, every memory of their 3 years together reframed now through the lens of everything that had happened since his cruel declaration in that crowded hall. She thought of the genuine anguish in his voice, so different from the cold distance he had shown at his coronation. She thought of Garrick's revelation, of Damien learning the full truth of her sacrifice only days before undertaking this difficult journey to find her. She thought of Idris's words, of the quiet dignity in choosing her own path regardless of anyone else's needs or expectations. She did not reach a decision that evening, the complexity of everything she felt refusing to resolve into any simple, clear answer. But as the stars began to emerge above the darkening fields, she understood, at least, that she needed to speak with Damien directly one more time, needed to hear more of what genuine change might look like, beyond a single, however sincere, apology delivered in a village square. Whatever she ultimately decided, she owed herself the clarity that only a more complete conversation could provide. Elena woke the following morning with a clarity she had not possessed the night before, the long hours of reflection beneath the stars having settled something within her that mere hours of restless thought could not have achieved. She dressed carefully, informed Corin of her intention to walk to the northern inn, and set out along the road, while the morning mist still clung to the fields, her mind steady despite the uncertainty of what conversation awaited her. She found Damien sitting outside the small inn, having clearly slept little given the exhaustion still visible in his features, though he rose immediately upon seeing her approach, something like cautious hope flickering across his expression. Owen, seated nearby, offered a respectful nod, before quietly withdrawing to give them privacy. "You came," Damien said simply, as though he had genuinely doubted she would. "I said I needed time, not that I would never speak with you again," Elena replied, settling onto a wooden bench near the inn's entrance, gesturing for him to sit as well. "I have questions, Damien. Real questions, not simply an apology I need to accept or reject." "Ask whatever you need to," he said, sitting across from her with an openness she had rarely seen from him, even during their closest moments together at the castle. "What happens to your kingdom now?" she asked. "The Pharaoh truce, the Thornfield alliance, everything that was unraveling when you left. Have you simply abandoned those problems to chase after me, or have you actually reckoned with what leadership requires?" Damien considered the question seriously before answering, understanding that her concern reflected genuine care for the kingdom, rather than simple personal grievance. "The Thornfield alliance ended by mutual agreement before I departed," he said. "Serafina and her father recognized, as clearly as I eventually did, that the arrangement was built on unstable foundations. As for the Pharaoh, Bray and Aldrich continue working toward whatever peace remains possible, though I understand now that lasting peace will require more than clever diplomacy. It will require the same genuine, personal trust you once built, something I cannot simply demand or purchase through political maneuvering." "And if I choose not to return?" Elena asked, watching his face carefully for his reaction. "What then? Will you find some other quiet, capable person to exploit for years before discarding them the moment convenience demands it?" The question landed with obvious force, and Damien's expression carried genuine pain at the accusation, though he did not flinch from answering honestly. "I hope," he said slowly, "that I have learned enough from this experience to never again take for granted the people who hold my kingdom together through quiet devotion. Whether you return or not, Elena, that lesson remains with me regardless. I owe you that change, independent of whatever you ultimately decide about us." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching for any trace of the calculating political instinct that had governed his earlier decisions, finding instead what appeared to be genuine, hard-won humility. "Why should I trust that this change is real, and not simply desperation born from a crisis that happened to threaten your throne?" "You shouldn't, simply because I claim it to be true," Damien said. "Trust is not something I can demand through words alone, especially not after everything I did to destroy it. If you choose to return, it would need to be built again, slowly, through actions rather than promises. I am not asking you to simply forgive and forget 3 years of taking your sacrifices for granted. I am asking whether you might be willing to let me try to earn back what I so carelessly threw away, with no guarantee of success, and full understanding that you owe me nothing in return." The honesty in his answer struck her deeply, so different from the confident, certain king who had once dismissed her without a second thought. She thought of Cale, of the gentle, uncomplicated peace she had found in Ashwood, of a future that could unfold there without the constant weight of political calculation and public scrutiny that had always shadowed her time at Voss Castle. She thought too of 3 years of genuine connection with Damien before that final betrayal, of a love that had never fully faded, despite everything, only been buried beneath layers of hurt and disappointment. "I am not the same woman who left that castle," she said finally. "I have found something here in Ashwood that I do not wish to abandon entirely, regardless of what I decide about returning to Voss territory. I have found people who value me, without needing to discover hidden ledgers of sacrifice to understand my worth. I have found peace that does not depend on anyone else's recognition." "I would never ask you to abandon that," Damien said quickly. "If you choose to return, it would need to be as an equal, valued openly and publicly for everything you contribute, not hidden away as a convenient secret whose sacrifices go unacknowledged. I understand now that whatever role you might hold, it cannot be one where your worth depends on my willingness to notice it." Elena sat with his words for a long moment, weighing them against everything she had experienced over the past week, against the genuine happiness she had found in her new life, against the undeniable pull of history and connection that still existed between them despite everything. She thought of her mother's old saying, the one about roads, that appear to be endings, sometimes proving instead to be simply turnings, and wondered which type of road she now stood upon. "I need more than words, Damien," she said finally. "If I were to consider any future with you, it would need to be built slowly, with actions that prove your understanding is genuine, rather than born from a single crisis that happened to threaten your throne. I would not return immediately, not as your queen, not with any grand announcement undoing what you so publicly declared. I would need time, and I would need to see, consistently, over months rather than days, that the man who traveled here to apologize is the same man who governs when no crisis forces his hand toward humility." "That seems fair," Damien said, relief and continued uncertainty mingling in his expression. "More than fair, given everything I did. What would you have me do, in the meantime?" "Return to your kingdom," Elena said. "Govern it well, honestly, with the same humility you have shown here. Rebuild what trust you can with the pharaoh, not through fear as others might suggest, but through the same genuine understanding I once tried to establish. Let your actions, over time, demonstrate whether this change is lasting or simply a passing response to crisis. And I will continue building my life here, healing my own people, without any promise of what the future might eventually hold." Damien nodded slowly, understanding and accepting the terms she offered, though clear disappointment lingered beneath his composed acceptance at not receiving the immediate reconciliation he had perhaps hoped for. "And if, after this time, you decide you wish no further connection to Voss territory, or to me personally, then I will tell you honestly, and you will need to accept that decision with the same grace you are asking me to extend toward your current apology," Elena said. "I am not making any promises today, Damien. I am simply choosing not to close the door entirely, while making clear that whatever door remains open will only stay that way if you prove, through consistent action, that the lesson you claim to have learned is genuinely lasting." They talked further as the morning stretched on, Damien sharing more details of the kingdom's current struggles, Elena offering occasional guidance on matters where her expertise might still prove useful even from a distance. The conversation gradually settling into something that felt less like a desperate negotiation and more like the beginning of a careful, honest rebuilding between two people who had once shared genuine connection before pride had nearly destroyed it entirely. By midday, Damien understood it was time to begin his journey back toward Voss Castle, his kingdom requiring his attention regardless of how this personal reckoning had unfolded. He rose from the bench, and Elena rose with him, the two of them standing in a moment of quiet uncertainty about how exactly to conclude this conversation that had shifted so much between them. "Thank you," Damien said finally, "for hearing me, even after everything. I know I have not earned forgiveness simply by traveling here and speaking honestly, but I am grateful for the chance to try earning it properly, over time, in whatever way you allow." "Do not thank me yet," Elena said, though something gentler had entered her voice, a softening that had not been present at the start of their conversation. "Prove yourself worthy of that gratitude first, Damien, Show me, and show your kingdom, that the man who rode 3 days to admit his failure is the same man who will govern with honesty long after this crisis has passed." He nodded, understanding fully the weight and fairness of her expectation, and after a moment of hesitation, he reached out and took her hand gently, not as a king claiming what he believed belonged to him, but as a man expressing genuine gratitude for a chance he knew he had not fully earned. "I will not fail this test," he said quietly. "Whatever else I have gotten wrong, I understand now, completely, what I stand to lose if I fail to honor what you deserve." Elena watched him mount his horse and begin the long journey back toward his kingdom, Owen falling in beside him as they set off down the same road that had brought them to Ashwood just a day before. She stood watching until they disappeared over the distant hill, and then she turned and walked slowly back toward her village, toward her family, toward the life she had built with her own hands in the weeks since a cruel declaration in a crowded hall had seemed to end everything she once knew. She did not know, walking that quiet road beneath the midday sun, exactly what the coming months would bring, whether Damien's genuine remorse would prove lasting, or whether the pressures of his throne would eventually pull him back toward the same pride that had caused this entire painful chapter. She did not know whether her own heart would ultimately lead her back toward Voss Castle, or whether the peace she had found in Ashwood, alongside Cale's steady, patient devotion, would prove to be where she truly belonged. What she did know, with a certainty that settled deeply and permanently into her heart, was that her worth had never depended on anyone else's recognition, not a king's crown, not a kingdom's gratitude, not even her own family's love, however genuine and freely given. She had given everything she had to a kingdom that ultimately failed to see her value until circumstances forced its hand, and she had walked away from that failure not diminished, but strengthened, discovering in the process a life built entirely on her own terms, valued for exactly who she was, rather than who anyone else needed her to be. Whatever path lay ahead, whether it led back toward the throne that had once called her unworthy, or forward into an entirely new future, built among the people who had welcomed her home without hesitation, Elena walked forward that day with her head held high, understanding finally and completely that she alone would decide her own worth, regardless of what any king, any crown, or any kingdom might ultimately choose to offer her in return.